When a notorious gang known as the Hellfire Riders rolls into the dusty small town of Cedar Ridge, their presence alone sends shivers down the spines of its quiet residents. However, it's not the gang's reputation that shakes the ground beneath the town's feet, but the revelation of the unassuming priest's hidden past. His name is Father Daniel Moore, a man of faith and simplicity. But beneath his humble robe is a past carved in blood and honor, one that no one in Cedar Ridge could have imagined. A past that, once uncovered, will rip apart the very fabric of the biker gang's criminal empire. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because tomorrow we have a special story for you. The wind howled across the plains, stirring the dust and the smell of dry earth into the air. Cedar Ridge, a town no bigger than a handful of scattered houses, stood quiet under the burning sun. The small church on the corner was tucked between two buildings, its weather-beaten cross almost fading into the brown backdrop of the horizon. The only movement in town was the occasional dog chasing a tumbleweed, or the lone farmer on his tractor making his way down the dirt roads. Father Daniel Moore was sitting at his desk inside the small church, the faint hum of the ceiling fan the only noise in the otherwise silent room. He had a quiet life, too quiet, he sometimes thought. His hands gripped the edges of the worn wooden desk as his mind wandered. He had been in Cedar Ridge for 5 years now. In that time, the people of the town had come to trust him, to confide in him, but he knew they only knew one side of him. The priesthood was his cover, a way to lay low and atone for the violent past that had once defined him. Outside the church, the first rumblings of thunder could be heard in the distance. It was the unmistakable sound of heavy engines roaring across the plains. Father Moore's breath caught in his throat, and instinctively, he stood up from his desk and made his way to the window. A line of motorcycles was approaching the town. Vintage Harleys with roaring engines, their riders clad in leather, their faces obscured by black helmets and skull patches. The smell of gasoline filled the air, a thick cloud of smoke trailing behind them as they sped down the road towards Cedar Ridge. It didn't take a genius to know who they were. The Hellfire Riders, the most feared gang in the western states. Their reputation was notorious. Rumors of drug smuggling, arms deals, and vicious violence that left no one untouched. And now, they were rolling into the small, quiet town of Cedar Ridge. Father Moore's heart raced. He hadn't been a priest all his life. He had done things, bad things, things that had left scars on his body and soul, but he had escaped that life. Until now, the Hellfire Riders weren't just passing through. They had a reputation for taking over towns, breaking people, ruining families. And Father Moore wasn't about to let them take Cedar Ridge. But how could he stand up to them? He was just one man, an old man, a priest. The thought of confrontation with them was absurd, yet the gnawing feeling of impending danger in the pit of his stomach wouldn't let go. The bikers roared past the church and slowed down as they approached the town square. The leader of the gang, a hulking man with a bald head and a snake tattoo running down his neck, dismounted first. His boots hit the ground with a thud, and he looked around the town as though measuring it up. He waved his hand, and one by one, the rest of the gang members parked their bikes and followed suit, their presence casting an ominous shadow over the dusty streets. Father Moore's mind raced. The church was his sanctuary, but it was also the only place in town with any kind of protection. There were no other buildings that could withstand the kind of assault the Hellfire Riders were capable of, and they were known to attack without warning. The leader of the gang, a man named Snake, turned to his gang with a sneer and pointed toward the church. "Let's see if the priest is home," he said with a voice that sent chills down Father Moore's spine. Without hesitation, the gang members began to walk toward the church, their boots echoing in the empty street. Father Moore's grip tightened on the windowsill. This was it. The moment he had feared for years had arrived. He had lived through worse, but this time, there was no way to outrun it. He had to face them. The church doors were thrown open with a violent crash. The bikers stormed in, their presence heavy with menace and power. Snake, the leader, stepped forward, looking down at Father Moore with a grin that could only be described as predatory. "Well, well," Snake said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Looks like we found the man of God." "You're gonna have to forgive us for interrupting your little prayer session, Padre." Father Moore stood tall, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been a soldier once, long before the collar ever touched his neck. And if these men were looking for a fight, they would get one. They had no idea what they were about to awaken. The Hellfire Riders filled the church with their chaotic energy. The heavy clanking of boots on the wooden floors mixed with the dull hum of their engines still ringing in the air. Snake stood at the front, eyeing Father Moore with an arrogant grin. The others fanned out behind him, their eyes scanning the church as if they owned it already. The smell of leather, sweat, and gasoline permeated the air, but none of them noticed the faint tremor in Father Moore's hands. For years, he had buried his past beneath the robes, behind the simple prayers and kind gestures. But deep inside, he knew that one day, sooner or later, it would catch up with him. It had been a long time since he'd seen men like these, since he'd fought alongside men who had no moral compass and no fear. The Hellfire Riders were bad, but Father Moore had once stood among men far worse. Snake took a step closer, his gaze never leaving Father Moore. "You look like a man with a past," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "A past you're probably running from." Father Moore didn't flinch. He had learned to hide his emotions, to bury them deep inside. But his mind flashed back to the darkest parts of his life, the parts he had hoped were long forgotten. His military days, the years he spent as part of an elite force. His hands had been stained with blood that would never come off. He had seen horrors, fought in places where men had no souls, and carried out operations that would have made even the most hardened criminals turn away. He had been dealt a force. The memories came flooding back, fast and unforgiving. He remembered the sound of gunfire echoing in the mountains of Afghanistan, the weight of the rifle in his hands as he wiped out entire insurgent cells. He had never hesitated then, never questioned his orders. The operations were always clean, precision strikes, no room for error. But what had started as duty had morphed into something darker, something far more personal. Father Moore had been a weapon, trained to do the unthinkable, and he had done it without a second thought. Until that fateful night, the night that had changed everything. "Are you listening, Father?" Snake's voice broke through his thoughts, snapping him back to the present. Father Moore blinked, steadying himself. He couldn't let them see weakness. "I've heard worse from the pulpit," he said, his voice calm, betraying none of the fear or rage that burned inside him. Snake chuckled darkly, stepping closer, his boots thudding heavily against the floor. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But you know, Padre, there's something about you that doesn't sit right with me. I can smell it. You ain't just some man of God hiding away in this old church. You've seen things, done things. I bet you've got blood on your hands." Father Moore didn't respond. He couldn't. The truth would destroy him. It was a part of him he thought he had buried for good. The gang members were crowding in now, the tension thick in the air. But Father Moore stood tall. His mind was a battlefield, shifting between the man he had become and the soldier he once was. Snake wasn't done yet. He stepped forward, his massive frame looming over Father Moore. "I think you're going to be real helpful to us. You know, we've got a little business to take care of in this town. And a priest like you, well, let's just say you could be real useful to us." Father Moore took a deep breath. He had to think. The bikers wouldn't just leave. They weren't here for a friendly chat. And he wasn't about to let them tear this town apart. But he also knew the truth. He wasn't the same man who had been a part of Delta Force. That man was gone. In his place stood a man who had found faith, who had sworn an oath to protect the innocent. But even the most devout could be pushed too far. Snake grabbed the collar of Father Moore's robe and yanked him forward. The raw power in his grip was unmistakable, but Father Moore remained unmoved, meeting the biker's eyes without flinching. "You've got a choice, Father," Snake growled, tightening his grip. "You either help us or I make your life a living hell." The gang members circled them, some snickering, others eagerly awaiting their leader's next move. But Father Moore was no longer just a priest. For a moment, he allowed himself to remember the warrior within him, the man who could take on armies and come out victorious. The calm expression on his face cracked just enough to reveal the fire beneath it. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he said softly. I've killed men like you before." The words hit the air like a strike of lightning, shocking even Snake. For a moment, the room fell silent. The gang members took a step back, their faces a mix of surprise and curiosity. Snake's grip on Father Moore loosened slightly, but his eyes narrowed. "Oh, really?" Snake sneered. "And just who are you then, Padre?" Father Moore straightened, and for the first time since the bikers arrived, his voice took on a different tone, one that was cold, steady, and filled with years of hard-earned experience. "My name is Daniel Moore," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I'm a man you don't want to mess with." It was the first time in years he had uttered his real name out loud. He had sworn never to go back, but there was no choice now. The man who had lived in the shadows, the man who had been trained to take down enemies with ruthless efficiency, was back. And he was not about to let these thugs desecrate his town. Snake's grin faded. Something in the air shifted. "I don't care who you were before," Snake growled. "You're a priest now, and you'll do as you're told." Father Moore smiled, the first real smile he'd worn in years. "Not today." With that, he took a step back, his fingers brushing against the edge of the altar. He was ready. It had been a long time since he'd had to fight, but the instincts had never left him. The predator was awake, and he was going to show these men exactly what it meant to cross him. The room grew still, heavy with tension. The Hellfire Riders had just met a force they never expected, and the war for Cedar Ridge had only just begun. The silence in the church was deafening. The tension between Father Moore and Snake was palpable, like the calm before the storm. The bikers stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to make of this quiet priest who had just claimed to be someone more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. For a brief instant, Father Moore felt the weight of his own words, the truth behind them. Snake's sneer faltered for a split second before he let out a short, mocking laugh, trying to regain control. Well, looks like we've got ourselves a real tough guy. Maybe you were a killer before, but that's not who you are now, right, Father? You're just another old man hiding behind a collar." But Father Moore didn't respond. He could feel the fire inside him growing, the floodgates threatening to open. He had been calm, contained for so long, but these men were testing him in ways that could no longer be ignored. His past was a shadow that haunted him, yes, but it had also trained him to survive. The moment he'd chosen the life of a priest, he'd hoped that the violence would stay behind him. But these bikers weren't giving him a choice. Snake took another step forward, his eyes narrowing as he sized up Father Moore. "All right, Padre, you want to play the hero? We'll see how long that lasts. You're out of your depth here." Father Moore finally spoke, his voice low and full of authority. "I've faced worse odds than you could ever imagine. You'll regret ever stepping foot in this town." Snake chuckled darkly, dismissing Father Moore's words as a bluff. But his hand hovered near the handle of the gun at his waist. "Enough talk. You'll either fall in line, or you'll regret it." Father Moore's eyes flickered to the altar, his hand brushing over the worn wood. He was ready. He could feel the pulse of adrenaline coursing through his veins. The priesthood had always been his shield, but now it felt like a mask. Beneath that mask, there was still a warrior, and this was a fight he wouldn't lose. Without warning, Snake lunged toward him, but Father Moore was quicker. In one fluid motion, he ducked and sidestepped, grabbing the edge of the altar as leverage. He pushed himself forward, his shoulders slamming into Snake's chest. The gang leader was thrown off balance, stumbling back into one of his own men, sending them both crashing into the pews. The bikers were momentarily stunned, their leader knocked off his feet. The sheer speed and power of Father Moore's move left them in shock. They hadn't expected this, and it showed. Snake was on the ground, rage in his eyes, but his pride hurt more than the blow itself. "Get him!" Snake roared, scrambling to his feet, his voice seething with fury. The Hellfire Riders didn't need much encouragement. They rushed toward Father Moore, their hands reaching for their weapons, their faces twisted in a mix of anger and disbelief. But Father Moore was already in motion, his body a blur of movement as he shifted, dodged, and struck with precision. A biker lunged toward him with a knife, but Father Moore twisted his arm with lightning speed. using the man's own momentum against him. The knife clattered to the floor, and in one smooth motion, Moore used his elbow to knock the biker's head against the wooden pew. The man crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he even hit the floor. Snake watched in stunned silence as his men faltered. They weren't used to being outclassed like this, especially not by someone who looked so harmless on the outside. But Father Moore wasn't done. He was just getting started. Another biker charged at him from behind, but Father Moore spun around, his foot coming up in a swift kick that caught the biker square in the chest. The man flew backward, crashing into a row of pews with a sickening thud. "Stay down," Moore growled under his breath, his eyes locked on the remaining bikers. He could see the fear creeping into their eyes now. They had underestimated him, and that mistake would cost them. Snake was seething, fury boiling in his veins. He had always been the one in control, the one who struck fear into others. But now, in this old church, the power had shifted. The priest wasn't just a man of God. He was a force to be reckoned with. "You think you can take us all down, huh?" Snake snarled, his voice tight with anger. "You're gonna pay for that." Father Moore didn't flinch. He was still moving, fluid and precise, as if the years of combat training were coming back to him with ease. His eyes never left Snake's, but he spoke to the gang members still standing. "I'm not here to kill you, but if you keep pushing, I'll make sure you never see another sunrise." The remaining bikers hesitated. They had expected a fight, yes, but not a fight like this. They were used to violence, but they weren't prepared for someone who could match them, someone who knew how to break them down. "Leave," Moore said firmly, his voice carrying an authority that made even the toughest men pause. "This is your last warning." Snake's rage finally got the better of him, and he pulled his gun, aiming it directly at Father Moore. "You think you're untouchable, huh? Let's see if you can dodge this." But before Snake could fire, there was a sound, a low rumble, like the sound of distant thunder. The door of the church slammed open with a deafening bang. The light from outside poured into the dim interior, casting long shadows across the floor. Snake's eyes darted toward the entrance, his gun still trained on Father Moore. Standing in the doorway was a figure, tall and broad-shouldered, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide-brimmed hat. The stranger stepped forward, his boots making a heavy, deliberate thud with each step. The bikers froze, their eyes widening in disbelief. Father Moore felt a sudden shift in the air, a presence he hadn't expected. The figure in the doorway wasn't just any passerby. This man had the bearing of someone who had seen war, someone who carried the weight of countless battles on his shoulders. The stranger's voice was deep, steady, and full of authority. "Put the gun down, Snake." Snake hesitated. There was something about the man in the doorway that made him uneasy. It wasn't just the calm in his voice. It was the sheer presence of him, as though he were someone not to be trifled with. The stranger stepped forward again, the light catching his face. His eyes locked with Snake's, and for a brief moment, Snake's confidence faltered. "You don't know who you're dealing with," the stranger said, his words carrying the weight of 1,000 battles. "But you will." Father Moore recognized the voice, and in that moment, everything changed. It wasn't just the past that was coming back to haunt him. It was the past coming to his aid. The man in the doorway was someone from his old life, someone who knew the darkness that had shaped him, and together, they were about to bring the Hellfire Riders to their knees. Snake's eyes widened as he stared at the man in the doorway, his grip tightening around the gun in his hand. The air felt thick with uncertainty now, every biker in the church holding their breath as they tried to understand what was happening. The figure in the doorway wasn't just any stranger. He had an aura about him, one that even the most hardened criminals could feel. Father Moore's heart raced, not from fear, but from a recognition that sent a cold shiver down his spine. The stranger's presence was unmistakable. It was the face of someone who had been there during the darkest chapters of his life, someone who had shared in the blood and the violence, and someone who knew all too well the cost of the past. A ghost from the days before the priesthood, a man who had walked beside him on operations that no one would ever dare speak of. The stranger stepped further into the church, his boots scraping the floor with each step, his eyes never leaving Snake's. His face was rugged, covered in a few days' worth of stubble, but his eyes were the same, sharp, calculating, and unnervingly calm. Snake, still holding his gun, barked, "Who the hell are you?" His voice was shaky now, his bravado crumbling under the weight of this unexpected development. The man in the doorway didn't answer right away. He simply looked at Snake, then shifted his gaze to the bikers who were still recovering from the shock of what they had just witnessed. He was sizing them up, as if he had seen it all before, like this was just another day at the office. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, cutting through the tension. "I'm someone you don't want to mess with," he said. The words hit like a slap in the face. They weren't threatening, but they carried the kind of weight that made Snake's hands tremble ever so slightly. The gun still hung in the air between them, but for the first time, Snake wasn't sure if he should pull the trigger. Father Moore's gaze flickered toward the stranger, his pulse quickening. This man, this soldier, had been part of the team that had once carried out covert missions that shaped the course of history. They had been soldiers, united by a code of honor that the Hellfire Riders could never understand. And now, standing here in this church, the stranger was a reminder of the life Father Moore had left behind. A reminder that his past wasn't finished with him yet. "Are you with him?" Snake spat, his anger flaring. He could feel the control slipping from his grasp, his every instinct screaming to fight back, to take down this intruder. But the stranger just stood there, silent and unmoving, his presence a force that Snake couldn't quite figure out. Father Moore knew he had to act. He wasn't sure what the stranger's intentions were, whether he was here to help or to finish something that had been left unfinished. But one thing was clear. The Hellfire Riders weren't going to walk away from this confrontation without paying a price. He needed to take control of the situation, and fast. As the bikers shifted uneasily, Moore stepped forward. His eyes locked onto the strangers for a brief second. A silent understanding passed between them. It was a look that only those who had seen war could truly comprehend. Moore took a deep breath, steeling himself for the fight ahead. Before Snake could make a move, Father Moore lunged toward him, his body moving with the fluid precision of a man who had spent years training for moments like this. Snake's gun swung toward him, but it was too late. Father Moore grabbed the barrel, twisted it away, and with one sharp movement, knocked the weapon from his hands. The gun skidded across the floor, far out of Snake's reach. The remaining bikers stepped forward, trying to close in on Moore, but the stranger in the doorway was quick to react. With one smooth motion, he pulled a tactical knife from his boot and hurled it across the room. It embedded itself in the shoulder of the closest biker with a sickening thud. The man screamed in agony as he dropped to the ground, clutching his wound. "What the hell?" another biker shouted, his face twisted in confusion. They weren't used to this kind of fight, where their targets fought back with the skill and precision of a soldier. The stranger moved with a cold efficiency, his every action calculated and deliberate. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice carrying an authority that silenced the room. His presence, his very demeanor, was like a battlefield commander giving orders to his troops. Snake staggered back, his face pale as he clutched his bruised ribs. His gang was crumbling in front of him. The fear in his eyes was unmistakable now, and the realization was dawning on him that the people he had come to terrorize were far more dangerous than he could have imagined. "Listen to me, Snake," Moore said, his voice steady. "This is your last warning. Leave now, and I won't kill you. But if you stay, if you try to fight, I'll make sure you never walk again." For a moment, Snake hesitated. The cocky arrogance that had driven him to this point was faltering, replaced by a flicker of doubt. He had never been outclassed like this, had never been faced with a force that could match his own ruthlessness. His gang was powerful, but these two men were something else entirely. And deep down, Snake knew that he was out of his league. "You don't get to make demands here, old man," Snake sneered, trying to find his voice again. "We're taking this town, and you're either with us or against us." Father Moore stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not interested in your war, Snake. But if you bring your violence to my doorstep, you're going to regret it." The stranger at the door didn't speak, but his gaze was fixed firmly on Snake, his stance poised as if he were waiting for the final command. Snake looked around at his gang, his mind racing. The bikers were beaten, wounded, and completely off balance. The fight was slipping away from him, and every instinct screamed at him to retreat. But he couldn't afford to back down now. His reputation, his gang's future, everything was at stake. And then, the stranger spoke again, this time with finality in his voice. "It's over, Snake," he said. "You've lost." Snake's face twisted in rage, but there was no fire left in him. The Hellfire Riders had been broken, their empire crumbling before their very eyes. And in that moment, Snake knew it was over. The stranger took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Snake's. The decision had been made. The Hellfire Riders were finished, and Cedar Ridge was safe for now. But the storm that had arrived in this small church was far from over. Snake's lip curled in a snarl, his fist tightening as if he could will the situation to change. The weight of his failure was pressing on him, heavy and suffocating, but there was no escape. The stranger was closing in, and the bikers around him were already questioning their next move. The air crackled with tension, an electric silence hanging in the space between life and death. Father Moore stood solid, his eyes locked on the leader, steady and unwavering. "You think you've won, huh?" Snake finally growled, trying to gather what little pride he had left. His voice was strained, a mixture of defiance and fear, but it faltered when he saw the stranger step closer. "You'll regret this." Father Moore's jaw clenched. It wasn't the first time he'd seen a man like Snake try to keep his ego intact in the face of defeat. He had been a part of missions where the enemy refused to yield, where the final act of defiance was often the most dangerous. But the Hellfire Riders were not soldiers. They were criminals, and Moore had the upper hand. "No, Snake," Moore said, his voice firm, unwavering. "You've lost already. This town isn't yours to take." The stranger's eyes glinted in the low light of the church, his face hard and unreadable. He hadn't said a word since he made his entrance, but his presence alone was enough to strike fear into the hearts of the bikers. There was no hesitation in the way he moved, no uncertainty. He was a man who had seen it all, and he was here to make sure that the Hellfire Riders didn't get another inch. Snake's eyes darted nervously between Father Moore and the stranger, his instincts telling him that this was the end. The gang, for all its reputation, was crumbling before two men whose lives had been filled with violence far beyond anything they had ever witnessed. He swallowed hard, the pit in his stomach growing. "Father!" A soft voice broke through his thoughts. Moore turned to see Sarah, one of the townspeople, standing just inside the door. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with both fear and gratitude. She had been one of the first to arrive after the bikers had stormed into the church. She had seen the chaos, heard the noise, but now she only saw the aftermath, the peace that had returned to Cedar Ridge. "Are they gone?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "They're gone," Moore replied, his voice steady, though 1,000 thoughts were racing through his mind. "But not without a cost." Sarah nodded, her hands twisting nervously at her sides. I don't understand. What happened in here? Who was that man? Why did they leave?" Father Moore took a deep breath, running a hand over his face. He didn't want to explain everything. Not yet, anyway. The truth was complicated, filled with secrets he wasn't sure he was ready to share. But Cedar Ridge had always been a town of simple folk, people who just wanted to live their lives without fear. They didn't deserve to be dragged into the darkness that had followed him from the past. "That man," Moore began slowly, "is someone from my past. Someone who helped end this nightmare." He paused, searching for the right words. "It's complicated, Sarah. You don't need to worry about it." But Sarah wasn't satisfied. She stepped closer, her brow furrowed in concern. "But you're not just a priest, are you? You're something else. I've seen the way how you fought. You're not just a man of God. I saw what you did back there. You're not who you've led us to believe you are." Moore sighed, his chest tightening. It wasn't the first time someone had seen the cracks in his carefully constructed facade, but it had never been this close to home, never with someone who mattered so much to the town. He had worked so hard to bury the man he had been, to build a new life, one of redemption, one that could be defined by faith and good deeds. But now, his past was bleeding through, and he wasn't sure how to stop it. "I'm not proud of who I used to be," he said softly. "But that man, he's part of that past. A part one tried to leave behind. The truth is, I was a soldier, a part of a special forces unit. We did things I can never undo." He paused, looking at Sarah with eyes that had seen too much. "I left that life for a reason. I thought I could live in peace. But I was wrong." Sarah looked at him with wide eyes, her voice barely a whisper. "A soldier?" Moore nodded, his expression distant. "Yes, I fought in wars you'll never read about. I carried out missions that would make your skin crawl. I was good at it, too good, but I didn't want that life anymore. I wanted to help people. I wanted to be someone else." Sarah took a step back, her hand trembling as she reached for the pew. She seemed lost in thought, trying to process what Moore had just revealed. It was a lot to take in, more than she had expected, but she could see the pain in his eyes, the weight of the choices he had made, the regret that lingered like a shadow. "I don't know what to say," Sarah whispered, shaking her head. Moore met her gaze, his voice steady but full of regret. "You don't need to say anything. You've seen enough. But you need to understand. That man who showed up, that's someone who knows what I used to be. He's part of that world I left behind. He's a part of me that I wish I could forget." But Moore's words seemed to hang in the air, unanswered, as they both stood in the stillness of the church. The quiet, once comforting, now felt suffocating. They were standing at the edge of something dark, something Father Moore wasn't sure he could outrun. His past had caught up with him in the form of a gang, but it was more than just that. It was a reminder that no matter how far you run, no matter how much you try to bury the darkness inside you, it always finds its way back. "I thought this was over," Moore muttered, almost to himself. "I thought I was done with all of this." Sarah gave him a sympathetic look. "Maybe it is. Maybe this time, it's really over." But Moore wasn't so sure. The presence of the stranger, the arrival of the Hellfire Riders, it wasn't a coincidence. Something bigger was at play. Cedar Ridge had become a pawn in a much larger game, one that Moore was no longer sure he could control. And as much as he wanted to believe that his past had been left behind, he knew better. There were more enemies out there, and they wouldn't stop until they had taken everything from him. And this time, Moore wasn't sure if he could protect Cedar Ridge. The town, for all its peace and simplicity, was about to become a target once again. And Moore was going to have to make a choice. Would he continue to fight, or would he finally let his past swallow him whole? The future was uncertain. But one thing was for sure, Father Moore's war had only just begun. Father Moore stood still, his eyes locked on Sarah, but his mind was somewhere far away. The peaceful silence of Cedar Ridge had been shattered, and the aftershocks were still rippling through his thoughts. Despite the defeat of the Hellfire Riders, the sense of looming danger hadn't dissipated. In fact, it had only intensified. The stranger's presence, the way he had handled the situation with such cold precision, it all pointed to something darker, something Moore wasn't ready to face. Sarah, still standing near the back of the church, watched him with concern, but also with a growing understanding. She had seen the man fight, and she had heard his words. There was no denying the truth of what he had said. Father Moore was no ordinary priest. He was a man of blood, of war, a man whose past had been carved in violence and darkness. "I need to go," Sarah said softly, her voice a hesitant whisper. "I need to make sure my family is all right." Father Moore nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. "Go. Be safe." She lingered for a moment longer, her eyes searching his face as if she were trying to piece together the man behind the collar, the man who had just fought off an entire gang with nothing but his bare hands and years of brutal experience. She had heard rumors, of course, whispers about the quiet priest who never quite fit in, the man who had come to Cedar Ridge under mysterious circumstances. But now, seeing him in the light of the recent chaos, those rumors no longer seemed so far-fetched. Father Moore turned his gaze to the door, watching as Sarah disappeared into the quiet streets of Cedar Ridge. The town was still, the bikers were gone, but the tension remained. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. The stranger, the man who had stepped in just in time, was still somewhere nearby. Moore knew that much. He wasn't just a passerby. He wasn't just some old acquaintance. The stranger had been sent, and Moore could feel the weight of that fact settling into his bones. A low hum of an engine broke the silence outside the church, distant at first, then growing steadily louder. Moore stiffened, his instincts kicking in, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the street. Was it the bikers returning? Or was it something else? A new threat? The silence that followed the storm never lasted long. He knew this better than anyone. The rumble of the motorcycle stopped abruptly. The sound of tires skidding against gravel filled the air, followed by the distinct click of a helmet being removed. Moore's pulse quickened as he turned slowly, his gaze now fixed on the door, waiting for the next step in whatever game was unfolding around him. He wasn't alone. The door creaked open, and the stranger stepped inside, this time without any dramatic entrance. His face was still obscured beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat, but the presence he exuded was unmistakable. This man was not just any soldier, not just another face from Moore's past. He was someone sent with a purpose, someone who knew Moore's history better than Moore himself probably did. Moore's breath caught as the door closed softly behind him. "You're still here," Moore said, his voice betraying a hint of disbelief. "I'm not going anywhere, Father," the stranger replied. His voice was gravelly, as if years of commanding men and confronting death had stripped it of any warmth. "Not until this is finished." Moore's brow furrowed. "I thought you were done. You walked away. You left this life behind, just like I did." The stranger chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "You think it's that easy? You think that once you walk away, the past just disappears? It doesn't work like that. You know that better than anyone." Moore's grip tightened on the edge of the altar. His chest tightened as well, the air thick with the weight of the stranger's words. It was true, of course. They both knew it. No matter how far you ran, no matter how many miles you put between yourself and the horrors you had once been a part of, they always followed. Always. And that's what this was, a reminder of the past that had once been his life, one that Moore had worked so hard to escape. "Why now?" Moore asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why come back now, after all this time?" The stranger didn't answer immediately. He took a step forward, his boots clicking against the floor with an unsettling finality. His face remained obscured, but Moore could feel his eyes on him, calculating, watching. Finally, the stranger spoke, his voice low and unwavering. "Because you didn't finish what you started." Moore's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "Those bikers, the Hellfire Riders, they're just a small part of something bigger. A bigger network that's been watching you, watching us. They've been waiting for the right time to strike, and now they've found it." The words hit Moore like a punch to the gut. He had known this moment was coming, but hearing it confirmed. He wasn't ready for that. "They know about you, Moore," the stranger continued. "They know your past, your connections, and they want to use it. They think they can break you, just like they've broken others." Moore stepped back, his breath shallow. The truth of it was sinking in fast, too fast. The fight with the Hellfire Riders had been nothing more than a prelude, a warning. The real battle was about to begin, and this time, it wasn't just a small gang looking to run roughshod over a quiet town. This was something far more insidious. Moore knew that when the Hellfire Riders returned, and they would, it would be for something bigger than just Cedar Ridge. The stakes had just been raised, and he had no idea what kind of enemy was waiting in the wings. The stranger stepped closer, his hand brushing against the handle of a large combat knife at his side. "We're not done, Moore, and neither are they. It's not just the Hellfire Riders we're up against. It's a whole network of criminals, mercenaries, people who will stop at nothing to tear you down." Moore took a deep breath. His fingers twitched at his side, itching for something, anything, to hold. It was a familiar feeling, one he had long since suppressed. He had hoped for a peaceful life, but now, it seemed his past had come full circle. The man who had once been a weapon of war was being dragged back into the fight, whether he wanted to or not. "I can't do this alone," Moore muttered, his voice hoarse, his mind racing. "I thought I could, but I can't." The stranger's eyes softened ever so slightly, the first sign of something other than cold calculation. "You don't have to. I'm here." And with that, Moore knew the fight wasn't just his to win anymore. The shadow of his past was pulling him back into the game, and this time, he couldn't run. Not from them. Not from the network that was about to unleash hell on Cedar Ridge. The town, once quiet and untouched, had just become a battleground, and Moore had to face it head-on. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight to protect everything he had come to love. And the storm was only beginning. The stranger's words hung in the air, thick and heavy with a meaning Moore couldn't ignore. The Hellfire Riders had been only the beginning. The network of criminals, mercenaries, and people who knew Moore's past, the people who wanted to break him, were waiting in the wings. And Cedar Ridge, this small, quiet town he had come to call home, was now caught in the crossfire. Moore ran a hand through his hair, trying to steady his breathing, but the weight of it all was suffocating. He had worked so hard to leave the life he once knew behind, to bury the man who had been part of missions that were too dark to recall, too violent to ever forget. He had tried to atone for those days, to rebuild, to find peace. But now, peace felt like a distant memory, a fleeting illusion. "I never asked for this," Moore said, his voice low but edged with frustration. The stranger stood across from him, his posture stiff, his gaze unwavering. He hadn't moved since he'd entered the church, and he wasn't going to. Moore knew that the man would stay until the job was done, until the past had been confronted and dealt with, whatever the cost. "I know," the stranger said simply, "but sometimes the past doesn't give you a choice. You should know that by now." Moore looked away, his fists clenched at his sides. He had spent years trying to outrun his past, to keep it buried beneath the fabric of his priesthood. And now, it was all coming back to haunt him. The life he had once known, the men he had fought beside, the missions that had left scars both physical and mental. They were all coming back, crashing down on him like a storm. "Who are they?" Moore asked, his voice tight. "Who's behind all of this?" The stranger shifted slightly, his eyes narrowing. "I can't tell you everything. Not yet. What I can tell you is that they're a well-organized syndicate with fingers in every illegal operation you can imagine. Arms dealing, human trafficking, drug trade. It's bigger than anything you've faced before." Moore's mind reeled at the implications. He had seen it all before. Factions vying for power, spreading their influence across borders. He had been part of operations that had dismantled such networks, operations that had left him with as many enemies as allies. But this was different. This wasn't just about taking down a criminal gang or a single terrorist organization. This was about his own demons coming back to life. "I've taken down networks like this before," Moore said, his voice gaining strength. "I can do it again. I have to." The stranger gave him a long look, almost like he was weighing Moore's words, trying to gauge whether or not they were true. "You can," he said quietly, "but not alone." Father Moore exhaled sharply, frustration and anger bubbling to the surface. "What do you want from me? You think I can just pick up where I left off and start killing people again? I left that life. I'm not that man anymore." The stranger took a step closer, his boots making a quiet thud on the floor. "And I'm not asking you to go back to who you were. But what I'm telling you is that this isn't a choice. The fight is already here, whether you like it or not." Moore's hands shook slightly. He was tired. Tired of fighting battles he didn't choose. Tired of always being dragged back into the violence that had once been his world. He had chosen this life for a reason. To be better, to be something other than the machine he had once been. But the stranger was right. The past had followed him, and now it was threatening everything he had built. "I can't protect this town if I'm running from myself," Moore muttered under his breath, more to himself than to the stranger. The stranger seemed to read the conflict in his eyes. He didn't say anything at first, just gave a slow nod, almost as if he understood exactly what Moore was going through. "I get it," the stranger said after a beat. "I really do. But we don't get to choose when we have to fight. It's happening now. The Hellfire Riders were just a signal, a message. The rest of them are coming, Moore. And when they do, it's going to be far worse. You'll need more than just your faith to get through this." Moore closed his eyes, the weight of those words settling in. He could hear the faint sound of motorcycles in the distance, the same hum he had heard earlier. The calm before the storm was over. I'm not running anymore, Moore said finally, his voice steady, though the storm inside him hadn't subsided. I'll do what I have to do. But this town, Cedar Ridge, this is my fight now. I won't let it fall. The stranger studied him, the faintest flicker of approval in his eyes. Good. You might just have a chance then, Moore nodded, but the feeling of dread didn't lift. It only grew stronger, like a cloud gathering on the horizon. He was right. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. Tell me everything, Moore said. What's the next step? The stranger shifted his weight, his eyes flickering toward the door. First, we prepare. They've already made their move with the Hellfire Riders, but this won't be a simple raid. They'll come in force. We need intel, and we need to know who's behind this operation, who's pulling the strings. Father Moore took a step forward, the weight of the responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. The fight wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about saving Cedar Ridge from a shadow that threatened to swallow it whole. Then we'll find them, Moore said firmly, and we'll make sure they never get the chance to destroy this town. With that, the stranger nodded. It's good to have you back, Moore. But as Moore turned toward the door, his mind racing with plans, his thoughts were interrupted by the unmistakable sound of motorcycles approaching. A low rumble, steady and sure, as though the storm he had been dreading had finally arrived. He wasn't ready for this. No one ever really was. But Cedar Ridge was his to protect. And this time, he wasn't going to let his past tear it apart. Not without a fight. The motorcycle's engines roared in the distance, growing louder by the second. The sound was unmistakable, a low, rhythmic hum that vibrated in Moore's chest like the beat of a war drum. The Hellfire Riders were back, and this time, they weren't just a ragtag group of criminals looking to stir up trouble. They were part of something bigger. Moore could feel the weight of that knowledge settle heavily on his shoulders. The stranger, still standing in the shadows near the door, didn't flinch at the sound of the approaching bikes. Instead, he simply turned, his gaze focused on Moore, unwavering. "Get ready," he said quietly. Moore nodded, his pulse quickening as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. He had seen battles, fought wars, but this was different. This wasn't a distant mission, some faraway conflict. This was personal. Cedar Ridge had become the battleground, and the enemy was closing in. The motorcycles were getting closer. Moore could hear the telltale screech of tires skidding to a halt, and then, the sound of heavy boots hitting the ground, each step like a thunderclap in the stillness of the town. "They're here," Moore said, his voice low but firm. Without another word, the stranger stepped forward, his movements swift and deliberate. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a set of keys and tossing them to Moore. "Here, take the truck. I'll cover you." Moore caught the keys, his fingers briefly brushing the stranger's hand. For a split second, their eyes locked, a silent understanding passing between them. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. This was about something much bigger, about preventing a force of destruction from claiming everything Moore had worked to build. As the stranger moved toward the back of the church, Moore turned and made his way toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He was ready. He had to be. He stepped out into the sun, the sharp heat of the afternoon sun making his skin feel tight as the shadow of the approaching storm loomed over him. The streets of Cedar Ridge were quiet, but that wouldn't last long. He knew the Hellfire Riders would waste no time in making their presence known. Just as Moore reached the truck, the first few riders appeared at the end of the street. Their silhouettes, looming large against the setting sun, cut through the haze of dust in the air. Snake, their leader, was at the front, his hulking figure moving toward Moore with the same arrogant swagger Moore had seen before. Behind him, the rest of the bikers fanned out, forming a tight, menacing formation. Moore's hand hovered over the truck's door handle, his breath steady. He had faced down worse than this, but the fear gnawing at the edges of his mind refused to let go. This time, it wasn't just about a fight. This time, it was personal. They had come for him, for the past that refused to die. Snake stopped just a few feet from Moore, his eyes narrowing as he studied the priest with a mixture of contempt and calculation. "Back for more, huh?" Snake sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "I figured you'd be the type to run and hide. But here you are, the little priest who thinks he can stop us. Moore's jaw tightened, his gaze never leaving Snake's. I'm not here to stop you, he said calmly, his voice carrying an authority that made the bikers hesitate. I'm here to make sure you don't destroy this town. Snake's lips curled into a grin, but there was no amusement in it. This town? You're a fool, Moore. This town belongs to us now, just like everything else you've tried to hide behind. Moore's hand brushed against the truck door again, his fingers tightening around the keys. You don't know who you're dealing with, Snake, but you'll learn. With that, he turned and jumped into the truck, slamming the door shut behind him. He started the engine with a growl, the low rumble of the vehicle vibrating through the chassis. The Hellfire Riders weren't going to just walk away this time. This time, they were in for a fight they wouldn't soon forget. As the truck roared to life, Moore slammed it into gear and tore down the street, the tires screeching as they caught the gravel. Snake's men scattered in all directions, trying to avoid the oncoming truck, but Moore was already weaving the vehicle through the chaos, aiming directly for Snake. The biker leader stood tall, defiant, as the truck barreled toward him. He gripped a machete in his hand, ready to strike, his eyes gleaming with a twisted sense of triumph. But Moore wasn't stopping. He pushed the truck faster, aiming for the biker with a steely focus. At the last second, Snake lunged, but Moore swerved the truck, narrowly missing the gang leader. The truck fishtailed for a moment, but Moore expertly corrected, keeping it in control as he slid past Snake and into the heart of the gang. The Hellfire Riders, caught off guard, scattered, shouting in surprise as the truck barreled through their ranks. Moore's heart raced as he slammed the gas pedal, weaving through the group, sending bikers flying as the truck hit them one by one. But this was just the beginning. The Hellfire Riders weren't the only threat in Cedar Ridge. The stranger had said there was something bigger. Moore could feel it, the heaviness in the air. The way the bikers' frantic movements didn't quite make sense. It was too easy. Something was wrong. Suddenly, from the corner of his eye, Moore caught sight of a dark van speeding toward them, its headlights flashing in the gathering dusk. The van was too large to maneuver quickly, but that wasn't its purpose. It was here for a reason. Moore's gut clenched as he realized the truth. The Hellfire Riders were nothing but a distraction. The real enemy had arrived, and they weren't here to take the town. They were here to finish what had started long ago. He slammed the truck into reverse, swerving wildly as the van skidded to a halt in the middle of the street. The doors flew open, and figures in dark tactical gear poured out, weapons raised. Moore's eyes widened as he recognized the insignia on their armor. The same insignia he had seen in missions he had hoped never to remember. The Syndicate was here. The true battle had begun, and Cedar Ridge was ground zero. The storm had finally arrived, and Moore had no choice but to face it head-on. This was more than just a fight for survival. This was a war, and Moore was ready to fight. The van screeched to a halt in the middle of the street, the harsh sound of metal scraping against pavement ringing out through the quiet evening. Figures in tactical gear poured out, their movements precise, efficient, like soldiers trained for one purpose: destruction. Their black armor gleamed under the fading light, and their weapons were pointed forward, scanning the area with cold, calculating precision. Moore's heart pounded in his chest as he swerved the truck, narrowly avoiding the first wave of attackers. He wasn't surprised. He had known something bigger was coming. He just hadn't expected it to arrive so soon, so violently. The Hellfire Riders had been a distraction. The real threat had always been these men. As Moore glanced over at the men in tactical gear, he could see the same insignia they wore, the same symbol he had seen years ago, when he was still in the field, when he had been a soldier fighting in covert operations. This wasn't just another gang trying to take over a small town. These men were part of something far more dangerous, far more organized. This was the network the stranger had warned him about. This was the Syndicate, the shadow organization that had been pulling the strings in the dark corners of the world. The figure at the front of the group stepped forward, his eyes scanning the area. He was taller than the rest, his face obscured by a mask, but Moore could see the confidence in his posture. He knew this man, though the name eluded him for a moment. He had been one of the leaders in the Syndicate, one of the men Moore had encountered years ago during a mission gone wrong. "Move out," the masked figure barked, his voice sharp, echoing in the growing chaos. "Find more. He's the target. Eliminate anyone who gets in the way." Moore's fingers tightened on the steering wheel, his instincts kicking in. He knew these men weren't here to negotiate. They weren't here to intimidate. They were here to kill. And they had come prepared. Without wasting a second, Moore slammed the truck into reverse, narrowly avoiding a hail of gunfire as it ripped through the air behind him. The bullets grazed the side of the truck, and Moore's pulse quickened. He could feel the cold sweat forming on his skin as he sped down the street, weaving in and out of traffic. There was no time to waste. If he didn't act fast, Cedar Ridge wouldn't stand a chance. He glanced in the rearview mirror, watching as the men in tactical gear followed him, their black vehicles trailing just behind. He could hear their engines growling, their heavy footsteps pounding against the pavement as they pursued him through the town. The Hellfire Riders had scattered, their bikes abandoned in the street. But these men, these soldiers, weren't afraid of a fight. They were trained for this. Moore's mind raced as he searched for a plan. He couldn't take them all on by himself, not with only a truck and his wits to rely on. He needed backup, and he needed it fast. He swerved the truck around a corner, pulling into a narrow alley that led to the outskirts of the town. The alley was tight, filled with trash cans and debris, but Moore knew it would provide the cover he needed to buy some time. He skidded to a halt, throwing the truck into park as he quickly scanned the area. His eyes flickered over the landscape, looking for something, anything, that could help him turn the tide. Just as he was about to get out of the truck and make his move, he heard the unmistakable sound of boots pounding the ground. The men in tactical gear had arrived. "He's here," one of them shouted, pointing toward the alley. Moore's heart raced, but he kept his composure. He knew he had no time to waste. He had to fight back, or at least make it out alive long enough to regroup. As the soldiers advanced, Moore pulled open the door of the truck, grabbing the shotgun that lay on the passenger seat. He stepped out, his feet hitting the ground with a thud. The cold air cut through his jacket as he turned to face the men who were now closing in on him. There were 6 of them, all heavily armed, their weapons raised and trained on him. "Stay down, Moore," the leader of the group called, his voice muffled through his mask. "This doesn't have to get ugly." Moore's grip tightened around the shotgun. "It already has." He fired first, the blast ringing out in the narrow alley, knocking one of the men back as the force of the shot hit him square in the chest. The man crumpled to the ground, but the others didn't hesitate. They returned fire, and Moore dove behind the truck for cover as bullets whizzed past him, some just inches away from finding their mark. His heart raced, but his mind was calm, focused. This wasn't the first firefight he had been in. It wasn't even the first time he had been outnumbered. But now, everything was different. This wasn't just a mission. This wasn't a nameless, faceless enemy he could fight and forget. This was personal. The man who had given the order, the one with the mask, wasn't just a soldier. He was a symbol of everything Moore had been trying to leave behind. And now, the sins of his past were catching up with him. These men were the ones he had once hunted, and now they were hunting him. "Move up," the masked leader shouted, and the soldiers began to advance, slowly but surely closing in on Moore's position. Moore's mind raced as he tried to figure out his next move. He couldn't stay in the alley much longer. The truck wouldn't provide cover forever, and these men were methodical. They'd flush him out soon enough if he didn't make a move. Then he heard it. A faint noise. A rumble in the distance. He looked up just in time to see a second vehicle rounding the corner, the stranger. The man who had appeared out of nowhere, the one who had given Moore the keys to the truck. He had returned. The stranger was driving a Jeep, and his tires screeched as he threw the vehicle into a tight drift, sliding it into the alley with precision. He didn't hesitate. The moment the Jeep stopped, the stranger was already out of the driver's seat, his weapon raised. "Get in," he shouted. Moore didn't need to be told twice. He dove into the passenger seat, slamming the door shut behind him as the stranger floored the gas pedal. The engine roared to life, and the Jeep surged forward, plowing through the alley, scattering debris as they raced toward the street. The soldiers fired at them, their shots ricocheting off the sides of the Jeep, but the stranger expertly weaved in and out of the alley, using the tight corners to his advantage. As they burst back into the open street, Moore could see the whole of Cedar Ridge before them. The town he had sworn to protect, now under siege by an enemy he could no longer ignore. The storm had arrived, and there was no turning back. "This is just the beginning," Moore muttered under his breath as the jeep roared through the streets, taking him back into the heart of the chaos. And in that moment, he knew the fight for Cedar Ridge was far from over. The jeep tore through the streets of Cedar Ridge, the roar of the engine blending with the sound of gunfire that echoed in the distance. Moore gripped the seat, his knuckles white, as the stranger navigated the winding streets with ease, swerving to avoid oncoming vehicles and soldiers who were now emerging from every direction. The town was under siege. The reality of the situation was sinking in fast. There was no running from this. The stranger's grip on the steering wheel was firm, his eyes scanning the road ahead, his focus unshakable. Despite the chaos, despite the hail of gunfire that rang out behind them, there was no panic in his movements. He was calm, collected, almost as if he had done this 1,000 times before. Moore's mind raced, calculating their next move, but the truth was, he didn't have much time. The Hellfire Riders had been the tip of the iceberg. The men in tactical gear, part of the syndicate he had tried to forget, were closing in. The entire town was a battlefield now, and he had to make sure it didn't become a graveyard. "We need to get to the church," Moore said, his voice steady despite the rapid pace of his heartbeat. "It's the only place with enough cover left." The stranger nodded, his jaw set. "Agreed." Moore knew that getting to the church wasn't just a matter of finding shelter, it was a strategic point. From there, they could coordinate, regroup, and figure out a way to push back. It wasn't the ideal location, but it was all they had, and it was the last place they could make a stand. As the jeep skidded to a stop at the intersection near the church, Moore felt the full weight of the moment. They were running out of options, running out of time. He could hear the distant hum of more vehicles approaching, the unmistakable sound of reinforcements. The masked leader of the syndicate had made it clear. Their goal was Moore, and they would stop at nothing to destroy him. The stranger didn't hesitate. He pulled the jeep into a tight space between two buildings, blocking the narrow alleyway behind them. As soon as the vehicle came to a stop, he was out of the driver's seat and on the move, taking cover behind the church's stone wall. Moore followed, his boots hitting the ground with urgency. His fingers brushed the shotgun at his side, his mind racing for a plan. Any plan that could turn the tide. They had the element of surprise. But for how long? It was only a matter of time before the enemy found them. "They're coming," the stranger said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've got one shot at this." Moore nodded. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the pulse of adrenaline driving him forward. His past, the soldier he had once been, was coming back to the surface, the instincts that had been buried deep inside him kicking into overdrive. The man who had fought in covert operations was still there, buried beneath the priesthood, beneath the walls he had built around himself. But now, those walls were being torn down, piece by piece. "We'll take the high ground," Moore said. "The roof. It'll give us a clear view of the streets. We can't stay here on the ground for long. If we do, they'll swarm us." The stranger gave him a quick nod, and together they moved toward the back of the church. Moore's mind raced as he analyzed the situation, his body moving on autopilot. The plan was simple: get to the roof, hold off the enemy, and wait for the right moment to strike. But they had to survive long enough to make that moment come. The back door of the church creaked open, and Moore could hear the faint sound of footsteps above them. They were already inside. The enemy had infiltrated the building. "We'll have to go through the back," Moore muttered. "They've breached the main entrance." The stranger pulled out a small, tactical flashlight and clicked it on, illuminating the dark hallway ahead of them. They moved quickly, staying low, their footsteps muffled by the thick stone floors. As they reached the stairs that led to the roof, Moore paused, his eyes scanning the area. The church was eerily quiet, save for the sound of his own breathing and the occasional creak of wood as they ascended. Just as Moore reached the top of the stairs, the distant sound of voices reached his ears. They were getting closer. The masked leader had sent men inside the church to flush them out. Moore's pulse quickened. The roof was only a few steps away. They just had to make it to the top. The stranger glanced at Moore, his eyes sharp. On three, Moore gave a subtle nod, his hand tightening on the shotgun. This was it, the moment of truth. 1, 2, 3. With that, they burst onto the roof, the cold wind slamming against them as they sprinted to the edge. Moore quickly crouched, scanning the streets below. They were surrounded. The tactical team had spread out, moving with military precision, their rifles trained on every corner, every building, every alleyway. They had anticipated Moore's move. They were prepared for this. Now what? The stranger asked, his voice steady as he took cover beside Moore. Moore's eyes darted across the landscape, searching for a weakness, a gap in the syndicate's line. The enemy had been closing in on them from all directions, but the one thing they hadn't accounted for was the height advantage they now had. Now we make them regret underestimating us, Moore said, his voice low but filled with determination. He grabbed the rifle at his side and set it on the roof's edge, taking aim at one of the men who was positioned near the far corner of the street. The shot rang out, a clean hit. The soldier dropped instantly, and Moore's pulse surged with the rush of victory. It wasn't much, one down, countless more to go, but it was enough to send a message. The stranger's eyes glinted. Nice shot. Moore didn't answer. He was already lining up another shot, his mind focused, his hands steady. As the rifle's barrel shifted into position, he fired again. Another soldier, this one further down the street, crumpled to the ground. But the enemy wasn't standing still. They were moving quickly, adjusting their positions and returning fire. The sound of bullets hitting the church's walls echoed around them, and Moore ducked, the sting of the bullet's proximity sharp and unnerving. They know where we are now, Moore muttered, his gaze never leaving the street below. We need a plan. Fast. The stranger didn't hesitate. He turned, his eyes scanning the area. We've got one shot at taking them out before they overwhelm us. We need to push them back. Moore nodded. Then let's make it count. With the enemy closing in, Moore knew they had no choice. They would have to fight like they had never fought before. Outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy who knew no mercy. But Cedar Ridge was his home, and Moore would fight to the last breath to protect it. The storm was in full force now. The battle had begun, and Moore wasn't about to let it be the last fight for Cedar Ridge. The wind howled as Moore and the stranger crouched low on the church roof, the distant sounds of gunfire ringing through the town like a cruel symphony. Their attackers, military precision, tactics honed from years of brutal operations, were closing in from all sides. The streets below were alive with movement, every corner a potential death trap, every shadow a hiding place for their enemies. But Moore wasn't about to let this town fall. Not today. Not while he still had breath in his lungs. We don't have long, Moore said through clenched teeth, his rifle steady in his hands as he scanned the streets below. We need to push them back now. If we wait too long, they'll pin us down. The stranger nodded, his eyes scanning the rooftops across from them. I agree. We need to make them think we have more backup than we do. Keep them guessing. Moore's mind raced. He knew how the enemy would think. They wouldn't come directly for them. Not right away. They would fan out, close in from multiple angles, and try to flank them. The element of surprise was gone now. The syndicate had already figured out their position. They would come with overwhelming force. It was up to Moore and the stranger to outsmart them. We take out their sniper first, Moore said, his voice low and focused. If we don't, they'll have the high ground, and that's game over. The stranger glanced toward the far side of the street, where the shadows of a figure in black armor were visible in the windows of a building. He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. Got it. On your mark. Moore didn't hesitate. He was already lining up the shot, his fingers squeezing the trigger with precision, sending a round straight through the window. The figure inside collapsed, the sniper falling to the ground with a soft thud. That was one problem solved. But they both knew it wouldn't slow the syndicate down for long. They had backup, and they were coming. Nice shot, the stranger muttered, peeking out from behind cover as he adjusted his gear. Keep your head down, Moore replied. They'll be looking for us now. The enemy began to shift their focus, and Moore saw the movement of soldiers spread out across the street, their weapons raised, searching for any signs of life. The tension in the air was thick, like the calm before a violent storm. Moore quickly motioned to the stranger. We can't stay here. We need to move to the other side of the roof. If we stay exposed too long, we'll get surrounded." Without a word, the stranger nodded and moved swiftly, keeping low as they sprinted to the other side of the church. They moved in sync, their training kicking in, every step measured, every movement deliberate. As they reached the other side, Moore peered over the edge of the roof. The enemy was closing in. This wasn't going to be easy. Moore looked over at the stranger. "We're going to have to split them up, draw them in." The stranger raised an eyebrow. "And how do you suggest we do that?" Moore's lips curled into a grim smile. "Leave that to me." Moore quickly reached into his pack and pulled out a handful of flashbangs. He adjusted the fuse settings and carefully tossed one toward the center of the street below. The explosion was deafening, followed by a blinding flash of light. The enemy's attention was momentarily diverted, chaos erupting in the street as soldiers scrambled to reposition. Moore didn't wait. He ran to the edge of the roof and fired off 2 quick shots. The sound of impact echoed through the street as 2 more men went down. But Moore knew this wouldn't be enough. They were fighting an enemy that adapted quickly, an enemy that would regroup and come at them harder than before. "Stay sharp," Moore said, his voice low but urgent. "They'll be coming from all sides. We need to make this count." The stranger nodded again, his eyes narrowing in focus. He raised his own weapon, scanning the area for movement. The street was a battlefield, with soldiers running to cover, trying to avoid the unpredictable shots from above. It was only a matter of time before the enemy would regroup and launch their next attack. Moore could feel the tension building, the inevitability of what was coming. "We're not out of this yet," Moore said, his tone steely. "We hold this position. We push them back. We'll give the town a chance." The stranger gave him a sharp look. "I've fought alongside you long enough to know you're not going to give up. But we need a plan. Fast." Moore didn't hesitate. He was already formulating their next move, his mind working through the options like a chess player calculating his next strike. The church was too exposed. They would have to abandon it soon. The town wasn't going to be able to hold out much longer under such a sustained assault. He needed to make a push, a counteroffensive. "There's a supply depot nearby," Moore said. "We'll use it as a choke point. We can draw them into a kill zone, force them into close quarters." The stranger looked skeptical but didn't argue. "I'll cover you. You go first." Moore glanced over his shoulder, checking the street for enemy movement. He could see figures beginning to regroup, moving with purpose, preparing for their next assault. The countdown had already begun. He gave the stranger a quick nod, then took a deep breath. He moved swiftly, ducking low behind cover, making his way to the edge of the roof. He leapt down, landing with a soft roll to absorb the impact. His legs ached, but he ignored it, keeping his focus sharp. As he crouched behind a row of boxes near the edge of the supply depot, he caught a glimpse of the enemy soldiers up ahead. They were moving closer. The time to act had arrived. "Now," Moore muttered under his breath. Without warning, he popped up from his cover, firing the shotgun in quick succession. The first shot hit one of the soldiers in the chest, sending him tumbling to the ground. The second shot was a perfect hit, taking down another soldier before he could raise his weapon. The rest of the soldiers scattered, trying to regroup, but they were too slow. Moore didn't stop. He fired again, forcing the remaining soldiers to retreat further into the alley, the blast of the shotgun ringing through the air. It was just enough to give them a few seconds to push forward, to gain ground. The stranger appeared from the shadows, moving with purpose, his rifle raised, taking down another soldier who was attempting to flank Moore's position. Together, they advanced, closing the gap between them and the remaining soldiers, keeping their heads down, moving fast, but steady. And then, just as the last of the soldiers began to retreat, Moore heard it, a sound that made his heart stop. The unmistakable whine of a helicopter's blades cutting through the air. "They've called in reinforcements," Moore muttered, his voice grim. The fight had just become much harder, but Moore was ready. The storm had only just begun, and he wasn't about to let it sweep him away. The battle for Cedar Ridge had escalated, but Moore had one thing on his side. He knew how to fight, and he was going to make sure that no matter what, they weren't going down without a fight. The fight for Cedar Ridge had reached its breaking point, and Moore would be damned if he let it break him. The sound of the helicopter blades grew louder, reverberating through the streets like a deafening warning. Moore's heart raced as he glanced upward, calculating their options. The helicopter wasn't just a mode of transport. It was an assault vehicle, carrying reinforcements that could easily tip the scales against them. If they didn't act quickly, it would be the end. The syndicate had outflanked them, and they had brought in the big guns. "They're bringing in air support," Moore muttered under his breath, his mind working overtime as he surveyed the scene. "We need to take out that helicopter now." The stranger, his face grim under the shadow of his tactical gear, glanced at the sky and nodded. "I'll deal with the ground units. You handle the chopper." Moore didn't waste a second. The helicopter would be the key to their survival. If they couldn't disable it, they wouldn't have a chance. He scanned the streets around him, looking for anything that could give him a fighting chance. "There's an old armory up the block," Moore said, pointing toward a building down the street. "If we're lucky, there might be something we can use." The stranger didn't hesitate. "Cover me." Without another word, the stranger disappeared into the chaos, moving like a shadow through the smoke and debris. Moore's gaze remained fixed on the helicopter, now hovering above the town with ominous intent. He knew that if they didn't take it down, it would rain down destruction on Cedar Ridge, and nothing could stop it. He sprinted toward the armory, his breath shallow, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The ground was littered with debris, fallen street signs, overturned vehicles, and bodies of men who had either been caught in the crossfire or were too slow to escape. It was a battlefield, a town on the brink of collapse. Moore's legs burned as he pushed forward, his senses heightened. He ducked into a narrow alley and then sprinted down the side of the armory, checking over his shoulder for any signs of pursuit. His mind was racing. He couldn't afford to hesitate. Not now. As he reached the back door of the armory, he pushed it open, the rusty hinges squealing in protest. Inside was dark, filled with the smell of dust and old equipment. Moore's eyes adjusted to the dim light as he moved quickly, looking for what he needed. Racks of old military gear lined the walls, nothing high-tech, but enough to give them a fighting chance. His hands moved swiftly, grabbing a rocket launcher and a handful of rockets. He had no idea if it would work, if he'd even be able to aim it properly, but it was their only shot. He heard the helicopter grow louder, its blades cutting through the air with an unrelenting hum. The town was crumbling around him, and the sound of it was almost overwhelming. It was like the last breath before the storm broke. Moore didn't waste any more time. He grabbed a rocket, loaded it into the launcher, and bolted back out into the street, heading for the perfect spot to take his shot. His mind was clear now, the panic he had felt earlier replaced by a cold, unwavering focus. If this didn't work, they were done. The helicopter was in his sights, a massive shadow against the setting sun. Moore knelt down, positioning the launcher carefully, his hands steady as he aimed at the underbelly of the chopper. His heart pounded in his chest, but his breathing was slow, controlled. With one final glance at the town, at the streets that had once been so quiet, so peaceful, Moore pulled the trigger. The rocket flew from the launcher with a loud roar, streaking through the air. Time seemed to slow as Moore watched it approach the helicopter, his eyes never leaving the target. The rocket hit with a deafening explosion, the force of it sending a shockwave through the streets. The helicopter spiraled out of control, the sound of its rotor blades screeching in agony as it plummeted toward the ground. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the impact. The helicopter hit the ground in a massive explosion, flames erupting from the wreckage as the town shook beneath Moore's feet. The smoke and debris clouded the sky, but the message was clear. Their first victory had come at a steep price. Moore stood there, his heart racing, his hands trembling from the adrenaline. The helicopter was down, but he knew this was far from over. The syndicate wouldn't back down that easily. They would regroup, they would adapt, and they would come back with more firepower. The stranger appeared at his side, his face covered in soot and sweat, but his eyes were sharp, filled with the same cold determination Moore had seen in him since their first encounter. "It's down," Moore said, his voice tight. The stranger glanced at the wreckage, then back at Moore. "Nice shot." Moore didn't smile. He didn't have time for that. The battle was far from won. The town was still in danger, and the enemy was relentless. "We need to get to higher ground," Moore said, his voice steady. "There's still time. We can't let them regroup." They ran toward the nearby buildings, moving fast, their steps synchronized, working together like a well-oiled machine. As they sprinted through the chaos, Moore could hear the distant rumble of more engines. The syndicate wasn't finished. The ground forces were coming for them, and they had reinforcements. The stranger motioned toward a building ahead. "There. That'll give us the advantage. We need to set up and wait for the next wave." Moore nodded, his eyes scanning the streets, assessing the incoming threat. They were still outnumbered. They needed to make the most of every advantage they could. They reached the building, taking cover behind its sturdy walls. Moore peeked out, his eyes narrowing as he watched the enemy regroup. The syndicate soldiers were positioning themselves, ready to launch another assault. "They're coming," Moore said, his voice calm despite the impending danger. "Get ready." The stranger didn't speak. He simply nodded, taking his position at Moore's side. They had one chance to break the enemy's momentum and push them back. If they failed, Cedar Ridge would fall, and everything Moore had fought for would be lost. And that's when Moore realized something that made his blood run cold. The enemy was coming for the church. They weren't just after him. They were after the town's last symbol of hope. The storm had broken, and now Moore had to do whatever it took to ensure Cedar Ridge survived the flood. Moore's pulse hammered in his ears, a steady thrum of urgency. The church, the very symbol of peace and sanctuary in Cedar Ridge, was their last bastion. The syndicate knew it too, and they were coming for it, coming for him, and coming for everything he had vowed to protect. The question now wasn't just how to fight them off. It was how to stop them from destroying the heart of the town. As the stranger moved into position, Moore's eyes locked onto the advancing enemy. The soldiers were methodical, their movements precise, as they fanned out through the town, converging on the church like wolves closing in on their prey. They had no illusions about what they were doing. They were here to finish it, to break him. "They're moving in," Moore said, his voice low but urgent. "They'll be here any minute. We need to slow them down. Hit them where it hurts." The stranger nodded, his hands tightening around his rifle. "We can't let them get to the church. If they breach it, we lose everything." Moore knew the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for the soul of Cedar Ridge. The church was more than just a building to these people. It was the place where they came to heal, to find solace, to pray for better days. It was a symbol of everything the syndicate wanted to destroy. "We don't have the manpower for a prolonged fight," Moore said, scanning the area around them. "But we do have one thing they don't: the element of surprise." The stranger glanced at him, his face expressionless. "And how do you suggest we use it?" Moore's mind was already racing, formulating a plan. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't safe, but it was their only shot. The syndicate might have more men, more firepower, but they didn't know the town like Moore did. And Cedar Ridge had secrets. Secrets Moore had hidden in plain sight, waiting for a moment like this. Back alleys, rooftops, the town's old infrastructure. "We'll use the streets as bait. Make them think we're cornered," Moore explained. "Then we'll hit them from above. The high ground. They won't expect it." The stranger's eyes narrowed. "You sure about this?" Moore glanced over at the church, still visible in the distance, its weathered spire cutting through the smoke and dust. The sound of approaching boots grew louder, and Moore's instincts kicked in. The time for hesitation was over. "I'm sure. It's the only chance we've got." Without waiting for further discussion, Moore and the stranger moved quickly through the narrow alleyways, taking cover behind old wooden crates and dilapidated storefronts. The sounds of the enemy grew louder as the soldiers neared the church, their footsteps like a drumbeat of impending doom. Moore's hands clenched around his weapon, but his mind remained focused, steady. They reached the first rooftop, one of the old, single-story buildings that lined the street. Moore glanced at the stranger, giving him a nod. Without a word, the stranger climbed the rusted ladder that led to the roof, Moore following closely behind. The metal groaned under their weight, but they both moved with purpose, knowing there was no time to waste. Every second counted. Once on the roof, Moore took a moment to survey the scene. Below, the enemy had begun to form a perimeter around the church. They were spreading out, methodical in their approach. Moore's gaze shifted to the distance, where he could just make out the silhouette of the church. It stood tall, defiant, a beacon in the middle of the chaos. He could see the enemy moving closer, too close. They were almost at the church's front steps. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "We need to act now," Moore muttered. His heart raced, but his mind was laser-focused on the task ahead. The stranger was already setting up his rifle, pulling it into position. "On your mark," Moore nodded. "Hold fire until they breach the gates. Then we make our move." For a few seconds, time seemed to slow. Moore could hear the distant sound of voices shouting commands, the faint rustle of fabric as soldiers adjusted their gear. They were almost there. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the knowledge that their next move would decide everything. "Now," Moore barked. The stranger fired first, a loud crack cutting through the air as the bullet found its mark, taking down a soldier who had been positioned near the church's entrance. The sound of the shot echoed in the street, shattering the stillness, and immediately chaos erupted. Moore didn't hesitate. He fired next, his shot taking out another enemy soldier near the church's outer perimeter. The soldiers below scrambled, disoriented, trying to locate the source of the fire. It was the break Moore needed. He quickly moved to another position, using the rooftops as cover, and fired again. Another soldier falling to the ground. But the enemy was quick to react. They returned fire, their bullets striking the roof with a terrifying crack. The metal and stone ricocheted under Moore's feet, but he didn't flinch. His focus was razor-sharp. "Keep them distracted," Moore shouted to the stranger, who was already moving, repositioning himself to another vantage point. Moore took another shot. Another enemy down. But there were too many, and they were pushing forward. He could hear the sounds of soldiers shouting commands, trying to regain control, trying to push forward into the church. "They're getting closer," Moore said, his voice steady. "We can't let them reach the gates." The stranger's voice was calm, but there was urgency in it now. "We need to fall back. If we stay here too long, they'll have us surrounded." Moore's mind raced as he scanned the battlefield, but his gaze kept returning to the church. The enemy was closing in, but the church was still standing. "For now." "Not yet," Moore said, his voice hard. "Not while they're still standing." Another shot rang out. Another soldier hit the ground. But then, just as Moore was about to reposition, he heard it. A loud, unmistakable noise that made his blood run cold. The heavy thrum of helicopter blades. Moore's heart skipped a beat as the sound grew louder. More reinforcements. They were bringing in air support again. The battle had escalated, and the enemy was now throwing everything they had at Cedar Ridge. Moore knew that the storm had only just begun. And this time, it wasn't just the church they were coming for. It was him. The helicopter blades cut through the air like a knife through flesh, and the unmistakable sound of approaching gunfire echoed from above. Moore's blood ran cold as the sky darkened with the silhouette of the chopper. The syndicate wasn't just attacking from the ground. They were coming at them from every direction. The odds were closing in, and the fight had only grown more desperate. "They're bringing in more air support," Moore muttered, his voice low but sharp with urgency. The sound of the helicopter's rotors was deafening now. "They want to make sure we're finished." The stranger didn't waste any time. His hands were already working, grabbing his rifle and repositioning himself behind cover. "We need to end this now. If they get control of the sky, it's over." Moore's eyes flickered over the scene, calculating the best way to break the enemy's momentum. The church was still standing, still a beacon in the storm, but the soldiers were closing in, their positions tightening with every second. The ground forces were pushing forward, but it was the chopper that was the real problem. It had the firepower to level the church, to wipe out the entire town if left unchecked. He glanced at the stranger, who was already moving with purpose. "We need to take it down. I'll get to the chopper. You keep the ground forces occupied." The stranger didn't hesitate. "I'll cover you. You don't have to ask twice." Moore's heart raced. He knew what this meant. He was about to make a dangerous move, a move that could either win them the battle or end it all. The chopper was too close now, its heavy rotor blades deafening as it hovered overhead, its guns primed. If he didn't act, it would rain hellfire down on them, and it would be too late. He sprinted across the rooftop, using the shadows and cover to conceal his movements. The wind howled, the dust swirling through the air, but Moore was focused. Every footstep felt like it could be his last, but he had no time for fear. Not now. As he neared the edge of the rooftop, he took a quick glance at the sky. The chopper was just above the church, hovering like a vulture waiting to strike. It was perfect. If he could just get into range, he could make his shot count. The helicopter's machine gun fired in a deafening burst, its rounds tearing into the church's outer wall. The explosion of gunfire caused Moore to duck instinctively, the air thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder. But he didn't slow down. He couldn't afford to. He reached the edge of the roof and peered down. The chopper's massive frame looming overhead, its guns swiveling into position. Moore took a deep breath, lined up his shot, and a sudden burst of gunfire from below snapped his attention back to the ground forces. They were closing in. Moore's heart skipped a beat as he realized the syndicate soldiers had reached the gates of the church. He had to make a choice. He couldn't leave the chopper to terrorize the town, but he also couldn't let the soldiers breach the church. Time was running out. His eyes flickered to the stranger, who was still providing cover, his rifle crackling with gunfire, taking down enemies one by one. The stranger knew what Moore was thinking. He was holding the line, but the pressure was mounting. They both knew what this meant. Moore couldn't wait any longer. With one final glance toward the church, he leaped from the roof, landing on a lower ledge with a thud. His knees buckled from the impact, but he quickly regained his balance. He sprinted toward the side of the building, moving low, using the corners of the alleyways to hide his movements. He was getting closer to the chopper, but as he rounded a corner, a soldier appeared from the shadows, his gun raised. Moore dove into a roll, narrowly avoiding the burst of gunfire. He slid behind a rusted car for cover, his heart pounding in his chest. The soldier's footsteps were close now. Moore's fingers tightened around his weapon. He didn't have much time. His chance at taking down the helicopter was slipping away. With a burst of adrenaline, Moore sprang from behind cover, firing a quick shot that took down the soldier before he had time to react. He didn't stop to check if the man was alive. He just moved, keeping low, keeping fast. The chopper was closer now. He could feel the heat of its exhaust, smell the burning oil. He was in position, but he needed to be certain. He needed the perfect shot. He reached a narrow alley that opened up directly below the helicopter, the low buildings offering just enough cover for him to stay hidden. Moore crouched, steadying his breathing, and took aim. His heart pounded in his ears, but his hands were steady. This was it. He exhaled, his fingers squeezing the trigger. The shot rang out. The rocket screamed through the air, hitting the chopper dead center, sending it spiraling out of control. The explosion was massive, the force of it tearing apart the helicopter's hull as it crashed to the ground in a fiery ball of wreckage. The sound of the explosion was deafening, and for a moment, Moore couldn't hear anything but the ringing in his ears. The town fell silent. Then, all at once, the chaos erupted again. The soldiers below, caught off guard by the loss of air support, faltered for just a moment. That was all Moore needed. He turned, sprinting back toward the church, his pulse quickening as he moved through the rubble-filled streets. He was almost there when the first wave of soldiers regrouped, rushing forward to fill the gap. But Moore wasn't done. He was out of time. "Stranger!" Moore shouted as he ran, his voice hoarse. "We need to push them back. Now!" The stranger's voice crackled through the comms, steady and clear. "I'm on it. We'll hold them off as long as we can. Get to the church, Moore. We need to finish this." Moore sprinted the last stretch to the church, using every ounce of strength left in his body. The walls of the church were visible now, their worn stone surface covered in the scars of battle. It was the town's last defense, and it was still standing. He pushed through the heavy doors, the sound of gunfire and shouting outside growing louder. Inside, the stranger was already setting up his position. The church was a war zone now, the once holy place reduced to a fortress under siege. But Moore wasn't done. Not yet. He reached for the last of the weapons. The old rifles, the grenades, the ammo left behind by those who had fought before them, and set them up in key positions. The lines drawn, Moore muttered to himself, "And we're not giving up this town." Outside, the enemy was regrouping, their fury burning hotter than ever. But Cedar Ridge still had one last defense, a group of survivors who wouldn't stop fighting. As Moore looked out toward the incoming wave, he knew one thing for certain. The battle for Cedar Ridge was far from over. But he wasn't about to let it fall without a fight. The storm had broken, but the storm hadn't won yet. The church walls reverberated with the sound of gunfire from all directions as Moore took his position near the church's rear entrance. His hands gripped his rifle, his fingers tracing the trigger, every nerve alive with tension. His breath was heavy, his body fatigued from the continuous fight, but there was no time to rest. This was the final hour. This was the moment they had to stand tall, no matter the odds. Outside, the remaining syndicate soldiers were closing in. The helicopter had been taken down, but they were relentless. It wasn't just about the air support anymore. It was about overwhelming them with sheer numbers, breaking the last line of defense before they reached the heart of Cedar Ridge. They wanted everything. They wanted more. The stranger, positioned near the windows, was surveying the street below, his rifle ready. He didn't need to say anything. Moore knew he was as focused as he was. Both men understood the stakes now. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight to protect what was left of Cedar Ridge. "They'll come through here first," Moore said, his voice calm despite the weight of the moment. His eyes never left the street outside. "We'll make them regret it." The stranger gave a brief nod, his eyes scanning their limited perimeter. "We're down to our last reserves. We make every shot count." Moore glanced around at the room. The church, once a symbol of sanctuary, had become a battleground. Every pew had been overturned, every corner reinforced with what little they had left. The stained glass windows, once masterpieces of light and color, were now shattered, their jagged edges standing as silent testimony to the battle they'd been enduring. The door to the church trembled as the first of the enemy forces reached the outer gate, their boots thudding loudly in the stillness of the town. Moore could feel the anticipation building, the sound of the enemy soldiers' movements sending a rush of adrenaline through his veins. They were closing in. This was the last line. There would be no second chances. "They're here," the stranger muttered. "Stay sharp." Moore didn't need a reminder. He could hear them now, the low murmur of voices just outside the church, the sharp clink of weapons being adjusted. He could feel the weight of the seconds passing, each one bringing them closer to a confrontation they couldn't avoid. The first wave of soldiers hit the church door with a crash. It splintered, with splintering in all directions as the door buckled under the pressure. The sound of heavy boots echoed in the hallway, and Moore's grip on his rifle tightened. The enemy was here. "Take cover," Moore whispered, already dropping to one knee, setting his rifle in position. The stranger, cool as always, pulled his rifle closer and set himself at the far corner of the room. He was ready. Moore exhaled slowly, waiting for the inevitable. The enemy would burst through the door at any moment, their faces full of malice, eager to end this fight. But Moore had his own plan. He wasn't about to let them waltz into the church without paying a price. As the door exploded inward with another violent thud, Moore fired first. One shot, clean and quick. The soldier closest to the door dropped instantly, crumpling in a heap. But the rest of the enemy didn't hesitate. They rushed through, returning fire as they moved in. The stranger didn't waste any time. His rifle cracked like thunder, taking out another soldier who had tried to take cover behind the pews. The sound of battle filled the church, the sharp staccato of gunfire mixed with the clattering of heavy boots, the chaos of a final stand. But Moore wasn't backing down. He fired again, his shot finding its mark, taking down another enemy soldier who had tried to flank their position. The church's interior was a labyrinth of shadows and light, and Moore used it to his advantage. His movements were swift and calculated, every shot clean, every decision made with purpose. The enemy was pushing hard, but Moore was faster. The walls of the church became a sanctuary of steel and grit. He could hear the soldiers shouting, scrambling, trying to push forward, but they were met with resistance at every corner. They hadn't expected this. The stranger moved with lethal precision, his rifle finding targets with unnerving accuracy. Another soldier fell, then another, as the fight intensified. "Keep pushing," Moore shouted to the stranger as he took down another soldier near the altar. "Don't let them get past us." They were holding their ground, but Moore knew this couldn't last forever. The enemy would overwhelm them if they didn't make a move. He had no illusions about that. He had been in enough battles to understand when the odds had shifted too far. "Get to the back and trance," Moore ordered, his voice commanding. "We'll push them out through the rear." The stranger didn't argue. Without hesitation, he moved toward the back of the church, his rifle trained on the hallway. Moore covered him, his rifle kicking with each shot as they picked off soldiers one by one. They were close, so close to breaking through the defenses, but Moore wasn't about to give up. Just as Moore and the stranger made it to the back of the church, the sound of more boots approached, their reinforcements. Moore's stomach twisted in anticipation. There was no time left. This was the endgame. But then, through the haze of the gunfire, Moore caught something. A shadow, moving swiftly through the smoke. His eyes locked onto it, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stop. It was another soldier, but not just any soldier. This one had a different insignia, one Moore recognized immediately. "Carter," Moore shouted, his voice filled with disbelief. Carter, an old ally, someone Moore had fought beside years ago, emerged from the shadows, rifle in hand. His eyes met Moore's, a grim understanding passing between them. "Thought I'd give you a hand," Carter said, a wry grin on his face. "Looks like you've got your hands full." Moore could hardly believe it. Carter had been thought dead after a mission gone wrong. But there he was, alive and fighting alongside them. "Get ready," Moore said, his voice low. "We've got one shot at this." Carter nodded. "Let's make it count." Together, the three of them moved swiftly toward the rear exit, where the enemy was closing in. The church was no longer just a battleground. It was their final stand. The enemy pushed harder now, their reinforcements arriving in full force. But Moore, the stranger, and Carter weren't backing down. With the church doors wide open and chaos raging outside, they held their ground. Moore glanced one last time at the altar, the walls, the very heart of the church that had once stood as a symbol of refuge. And then, with a final rallying cry, they launched forward, fighting like they had nothing left to lose. The storm had broken, but this time, Moore and his allies would stand as the last defenders of Cedar Ridge, and they would fight until the very end. The roar of gunfire never ceased. It was deafening, reverberating off the walls of the church as Moore, the stranger, and Carter fought with everything they had left. The enemy had poured into Cedar Ridge with everything they could muster: ground forces, tactical soldiers, and the helicopter that had been taken down, only to be replaced with an even greater threat. And yet, despite it all, the church had stood strong. Their last line of defense was holding, barely, but holding. Moore's heart pounded as he dashed across the church's back hallway, his boots striking the worn floorboards with urgency. The sounds of the battle were fading into the background, and his focus narrowed, laser-sharp. Carter and the stranger were already in position, covering the entrance that led to the rear exit. If they were going to hold off the remaining soldiers and force them back, this was it. No more time for second chances. The enemy was pushing hard from the streets, and Moore knew it wasn't just about the fight anymore. It was about the town. Cedar Ridge had become the focal point of a battle they couldn't afford to lose. The syndicate wanted to erase everything: the town, its people, the hope that had survived for so long. Moore wasn't going to let that happen. "They'll be coming from all directions," Moore said, his voice gruff, but filled with resolve. "We make our stand here. The moment they breach the gates, we hit them hard." Carter gave him a quick nod. "Understood. We're ready." The stranger, crouched near the church's rear windows, adjusted his rifle with practiced ease. "This is it. We hold them here, or it's over." Moore's eyes flicked to the horizon. Through the gaps in the walls, past the gunfire, and beyond the smoke rising from the distant wreckage of the helicopter. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the town. It was a strange beauty in the middle of the chaos, a quiet reminder of everything that was at stake. Cedar Ridge might have been small, but it was everything to the people who called it home. Moore would defend it with his life. "We don't let them take it," Moore said, clenching his jaw. The distant sound of engines caught his attention, and a low rumble signaled that the last wave of reinforcements was nearing. He could see the silhouette of a truck speeding toward them, the headlights cutting through the smoke. They were coming in force, and Moore knew it was time to act. The stranger took a steadying breath and lowered his rifle. "They're here." Moore didn't hesitate. "Ready yourselves. Now." The doors to the church trembled as the soldiers outside started to push forward. Moore and the stranger exchanged a quick glance, then moved into position. Carter was already by the rear exit, keeping watch for any sign of the enemy. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with anticipation. This was their final shot at holding back the storm. Moore positioned himself next to the shattered remains of a stained glass window. The shards of glass glittered like diamonds in the low light, a stark contrast to the blood and debris that littered the floor. He peered outside, watching the soldiers as they advanced, their heavy boots crunching on the gravel, their weapons raised. Then, in a blur of movement, the first soldier appeared in the doorway, just as Moore expected. He fired first, his bullet finding its mark in the soldier's chest. The man fell to the ground with a heavy thud. But there were more. Moore's heart raced as he ducked behind cover, quickly reloading, eyes never leaving the door. The stranger's rifle fired once, twice, sending two more soldiers tumbling to the floor in rapid succession. Carter's movements were fluid, the precise shots from his position near the rear door taking out anyone who dared approach. But for every soldier that fell, more came. It was relentless. Moore's breath quickened as the sound of more boots grew louder. The soldiers were charging the church from all directions now, using the chaos to their advantage. They were getting closer. Carter's voice cut through the noise. "They're trying to flank us from the west side. Moore, cover me while I take them out." Without waiting for a response, Carter was gone, vanishing into the shadows as he made his way around the side of the church. Moore didn't have time to question it. He had his own problems to deal with. He aimed his rifle at the doorway once again, firing 2 quick shots. Another soldier down. But there was no time to celebrate, no time for relief. "Incoming!" the stranger shouted as another wave of soldiers appeared at the far end of the street. The truck had arrived, and they were bringing in reinforcements. Moore didn't hesitate. He grabbed a grenade from his belt and hurled it toward the entrance. The explosion was deafening, sending a shockwave through the church, the force of it rattling the walls. Several soldiers near the door were thrown backward, their bodies tumbling to the ground. But it wasn't enough. More soldiers poured in, relentless, their voices shouting orders, their footsteps nearing. Moore's grip on his rifle tightened. "Keep firing," he shouted, his voice booming over the sounds of battle. "We're not backing down." The stranger fired again, his shots finding their marks with deadly accuracy. But still, the enemy kept coming. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder, the ground slick with blood, and the sound of explosions and screams echoed all around. Cedar Ridge was being torn apart. And yet, Moore wasn't going to let it go down without a fight. A sudden crash from the back entrance jolted him back to the present. Carter's voice came over the comms, his voice tight with urgency. "I need cover. They're pushing me back." Moore turned to the stranger. "We need to back him up. Now." Without wasting a second, they moved together, taking the long route through the wrecked church, keeping low as more soldiers stormed the front. Moore's mind raced as he calculated every step. They were running out of time, running out of options. But he refused to give up. Not now. Not when the town was still standing. They burst through the back hallways and emerged outside just in time to see Carter under fire from 2 soldiers, both closing in fast. Without thinking, Moore fired, his shot hitting one soldier in the back. The other turned, raising his weapon toward Carter, but the stranger was already on him, firing first. The soldier collapsed to the ground, his weapon slipping from his hands. "Thanks," Carter said, his breath heavy, but a smirk tugging at his lips. Couldn't have held them off much longer. Moore didn't respond. He turned toward the church, his eyes scanning the street. The enemy wasn't finished. They were regrouping for one final assault. "This isn't over yet," Moore said, his voice low but filled with determination. They'll come at us again. We hold them off here. If we fail, they'll take the church and the town goes with it." Carter nodded, his expression grim. "Then we fight until the last." With the sound of the enemy still pushing forward, Moore and his allies readied themselves. The final wave was coming, but they would hold Cedar Ridge, no matter the cost. The storm had broken, and now Cedar Ridge had its defenders. The battle raged on, the thundering sound of gunfire and explosions punctuating the night air. Moore, Carter, and the stranger had fought valiantly, holding the line with everything they had, but the enemy was relentless. The town of Cedar Ridge, the small haven of peace Moore had sworn to protect, was slipping through their fingers. But Moore wasn't going to let it go without a final push. This fight wasn't over. Not while he still drew breath. The streets were flooded with enemy forces, a tide of soldiers marching relentlessly toward the heart of the town, toward the church. It was the last standing symbol of hope in Cedar Ridge, and Moore had no intention of letting it fall. "We hold them here," Moore said, his voice hard and resolute. "The town can't survive if they breach this place." Carter's hand tightened on his rifle, his eyes scanning the chaos. The stranger moved silently alongside them, his rifle at the ready, poised to strike at the first sign of movement. The three of them were the last line of defense. If they fell, Cedar Ridge would fall with them. Moore knew this was the final act. The enemy had pushed them back, cornered them into the heart of the town, but they hadn't broken them. He could feel the weight of the town's survival on his shoulders. The lives of everyone here depended on what happened in the next few minutes. If they failed, Cedar Ridge would become just another forgotten casualty in the Syndicate's war. Moore looked toward the distant sounds of their advancing forces, the rumble of their heavy trucks and the clatter of boots on the pavement. The final wave was coming, and this time, the enemy wasn't going to stop until they had everything. "They're closing in fast," Carter said, his eyes narrowing as he peered out from behind cover. "We need to hit them hard. If we don't stop them here, we're done." Moore nodded grimly. He had been in enough firefights to know that time was their enemy now. But they had one advantage left: the town's geography. The narrow streets, the old buildings, and the rooftops all gave them the edge they needed. Moore quickly formulated a plan. "We split up. The stranger and I will take the rooftops. Carter, you stay low and keep them distracted with the firepower. We'll hit them from both sides. Once they're pinned down, we push them back." Carter gave a quick nod. "You can count on me." The trio moved quickly, spreading out to cover their assigned positions. The air around them was thick with smoke and dust, the smell of burning debris heavy in the air. Moore's mind was focused, every instinct honed from years of combat, knowing that the next few moments would determine the fate of Cedar Ridge. The stranger disappeared into the shadows, making his way to the nearest rooftop with practiced ease. Moore followed close behind, his heart racing as the sound of enemy chatter grew louder. He knew what was coming. They were organizing for their final assault, trying to surround them. From above, Moore had a perfect vantage point. He could see everything. The enemy forces were spread out, forming a perimeter around the church, but they hadn't anticipated Moore's counterattack. He took aim at a group of soldiers huddling near the church's steps and fired. The first man dropped, the shot echoing through the streets. The others scattered in confusion, looking for cover. He could hear the stranger firing from another position, the sharp crack of his rifle ringing through the chaos. The enemy's confusion grew, their movements more erratic as they tried to regain their footing. "Carter now," Moore shouted. From below, Carter opened fire, his shots striking the soldiers with deadly accuracy. He moved quickly, dodging behind the remains of an old storefront, his rifle blasting in rhythm with the chaos. The enemy soldiers hesitated, caught in a crossfire they weren't prepared for. Moore's rifle cracked again, taking down another soldier. With the strangers and Carter's support, they were beginning to slow the advance. But there were still too many of them. Moore could see the reinforcements arriving, trucks, jeeps, and more soldiers flooding the streets, blocking off their escape routes. "This is it," Moore shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of battle. "We've got to hold them off." With renewed resolve, Moore moved along the roof, adjusting his aim to the approaching vehicles. He couldn't allow them to reach the church. It was their last chance to turn the tide. A truck roared toward the gates, its engine howling as it barreled through the street. Moore adjusted his sights and fired, the explosion of gunpowder and the sharp crack of the rifle reverberating through the churchyard. The truck swerved, the engine sputtering and smoking as it lost control and crashed into the side of a building. "Nice shot," Carter called out from below. But the victory was short-lived. The enemy didn't hesitate. More trucks were on the way. More soldiers were advancing. The enemy wasn't just fighting for control. They were fighting to destroy everything Moore had come to love about Cedar Ridge. And they weren't going to stop until they had it. Moore gritted his teeth. "We can't let them reach the gates." The final wave was almost upon them. The enemy soldiers were too close now, advancing with fury. Moore's pulse was racing. He fired again, taking down 2 soldiers who had been aiming for Carter. The stranger was still on the rooftops, his shots finding targets with precision. But there was no denying the fact they were outnumbered. "We can't hold them off forever," Carter yelled, ducking behind cover. Moore's mind raced as he scanned the battlefield. The town was crumbling, the last of its defenses buckling under the pressure. But there was still one chance, one final chance to turn the tide. He grabbed the grenade at his belt and tossed it toward the center of the enemy's line. The explosion rang out, sending debris flying in every direction, throwing the soldiers into chaos. For a brief moment, their advance faltered. "Now," Moore shouted, "push them back." He and the stranger opened fire again, their combined shots striking the remaining soldiers with precision. Carter's shots echoed from below as he took down another soldier making his way toward the church. The 3 of them were still standing. The battle wasn't over yet, but Moore knew they couldn't keep this up for much longer. They needed reinforcements, quickly. And then, through the dust and smoke, he heard it, the unmistakable roar of motorcycles in the distance. The Hellfire Riders. They were coming, but this time, they were here to stay. The final battle had just begun. The roar of the motorcycles grew louder, echoing through the streets like thunder. Moore's heart skipped a beat as the unmistakable sound of the Hellfire Riders' engines filled the air. Their arrival was a turning point, a new phase in the battle. This wasn't just an enemy reinforcements arriving. This was a full-scale attack. And Moore knew it would be their final test. "They're here," Moore muttered, the words barely escaping his lips as he surveyed the chaos around him. The sounds of motorcycles revving filled the air, the heavy rumble signaling the arrival of the Hellfire Riders. It wasn't just a handful of them. It was a full-on assault. The streets were now alive with movement, the unmistakable sight of bikers clad in leather, their faces covered in skull masks, racing toward them. They weren't coming in small numbers this time. They were coming to finish what they had started. Moore's pulse quickened as the first wave of bikers entered the fray. They skidded to a halt near the main gates of the church, dismounting with ferocity. The machines roared as they kicked up dust, the smell of gasoline mixing with the acrid scent of gunpowder already in the air. "Stay focused," Moore shouted to Carter and the stranger, his voice sharp and commanding. "We hold the line, no matter what." The stranger nodded, his face set in a hard, determined expression. He was already aiming his rifle at the incoming riders, ready to take out the first threat that emerged. The sound of the enemy's motorcycles echoed through the streets like a death knell, the air crackling with the promise of violence. But Moore didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. The battle was far from over, and if the Hellfire Riders made it past them, Cedar Ridge would be lost. He grabbed a grenade, his fingers deftly working the pin loose, and hurled it into the group of bikers advancing at the gates. The explosion tore through the air, sending men and motorcycles flying in all directions. The blast left a cloud of dust in its wake, but the riders didn't stop. "They're relentless," Carter called out, firing rapidly as more bikers advanced. Moore's rifle kicked in his hands, each shot echoing in his chest as he picked off one rider after another, each bullet finding its mark. He wasn't missing. He couldn't afford to. The enemy was too close now. If they reached the gates, the town would fall. And there were too many of them to stop with just one shot. The stranger was already moving, taking out riders with unerring accuracy. His rifle cracked with each shot, knocking down the bikers as they tried to rush the church's gates. But they were coming in waves, and Moore could see the desperation in their faces. They wouldn't stop, not until Cedar Ridge was theirs. "We've got to finish them now," Moore shouted, his voice strained with urgency. "Push them back. Don't let them get closer." Carter's voice came through, cool but filled with intensity. "I'm not letting them take another step. Keep pushing." The sound of more explosions rattled through the air as another round of grenades from their side tore into the enemy ranks. The blast shook the ground beneath them, but it didn't slow the riders. They were still coming. Moore's jaw clenched, his muscles taut as he aimed for another target. There had to be a way to stop them. There had to be. He fired again, the round landing perfectly as another rider fell. But for every one that dropped, two more appeared. The gates were beginning to shake under the pressure of the bikers' assault. Moore glanced over at Carter, who was already reloading his rifle, his eyes steely as he fought off wave after wave. "We need reinforcements," Moore shouted over the chaos. The stranger moved into position, his movements fluid and precise as he continued to pick off riders. But it wasn't enough. The Hellfire Riders were too many. The back of Moore's mind raced as he looked for another solution. The sound of motorcycles filled the air, louder now, as though the very earth itself was shaking under their weight. Suddenly, a flash of movement caught his eye. Another group of soldiers, but this time, they weren't from the syndicate. They were on their own bikes, racing toward the church, their helmets reflecting the light of the setting sun. They weren't wearing the same armor or insignia as the Hellfire Riders. They were different. These were allies. "Hold on," Moore shouted, his eyes narrowing. "It's our backup." The new riders sped through the dust-filled air, their engines roaring like a beast awakened. They tore through the advancing Hellfire Riders with the force of a freight train, knocking them aside as they barreled through. Moore watched in awe as these new reinforcements poured into the battle, taking down enemy riders with incredible speed and precision. The Hellfire Riders were thrown into disarray, their formation unraveling as they tried to regroup. Moore wasted no time. He grabbed another grenade and tossed it into the center of their mass, the explosion lighting up the street as the riders scattered in all directions. "Take that," Carter shouted as he fired a clean shot into another rider's chest, sending him sprawling across the pavement. The tide was shifting. The enemy was faltering. The backup riders were here, finally. The battle wasn't over, but the momentum had shifted in their favor. Moore allowed himself a brief moment of relief. They had the advantage, but only for a moment. He couldn't afford to lose focus. "Keep up the pressure," Moore barked, his voice cutting through the battle's din. "We finish this now." The reinforcements charged forward, working in tandem with Moore, Carter, and the stranger as they took out the remaining Hellfire Riders. The bikers, once so confident, were now scattered, disoriented, and outnumbered. Their ranks were thinning, their attack faltering. Moore didn't stop firing. He could see the desperation in the enemy's faces as they realized they had lost. The backup riders pushed forward, their guns blazing as they took down the last of the attackers. The battle seemed to go on forever, the deafening noise of gunfire and explosions filling the air. But slowly, as the final riders fell, the chaos began to subside. The enemy had been pushed back. The gates of the church were still standing, and Cedar Ridge had survived. For now, the dust settled over the town, and Moore stood tall, his chest heaving as he surveyed the battlefield. The enemy was gone. The church still stood. The town was still alive, and Cedar Ridge had been saved. For now, but Moore knew this was just the beginning. The syndicate wouldn't stop, and neither would he. As he looked over at Carter and the stranger, he saw the same determination in their eyes. "We're not finished yet," Moore said, his voice grim but resolute. "The battle may be over, but the war is just beginning." And with that, he turned toward the horizon, ready for whatever came next. Because Cedar Ridge wasn't just a town. It was their home, and Moore would fight for it. Until the very end, the sun had finally set, casting a blanket of darkness over Cedar Ridge. The last of the enemy bikers lay scattered across the streets, the fires from the wrecked vehicles flickering dimly in the distance. The sound of gunfire had ceased, replaced by the distant hum of the remaining backup riders. It was over, for now. Moore stood in the middle of the street, his rifle still clutched tightly in his hands, eyes scanning the quiet town. His breath was shallow, his body sore from the hours of relentless fighting. But there was no time to rest. Not yet. He couldn't afford it. Carter stood beside him, his rifle slung across his back, looking out over the wreckage. His face was streaked with dirt, blood, and sweat, but there was a grim satisfaction in his expression. We did it. We stopped them. Moore's gaze remained fixed ahead, his eyes narrowing. Not all of them. They'll be back. They'll regroup, send more forces. This isn't over. The stranger, still as stoic as ever, nodded in agreement. He wiped the sweat from his brow, eyes scanning the wreckage. The town's still standing, but we've lost too much. We can't keep fighting this battle without a plan. Moore turned to face them, his expression hardening. We'll rebuild, but we need to be ready. They'll come again, and next time, they'll bring everything they've got. The sound of motorcycle engines broke through the stillness of the night, but this time, Moore didn't flinch. He had learned the difference between the enemy's engines and those of their allies. The backup riders, those who had come in the final moments to tip the scales in their favor, were now returning, their faces hidden behind their helmets, their expressions unreadable. One rider dismounted and walked toward them. It was a woman, her face covered by a helmet, but there was something about the way she carried herself that told Moore she was no ordinary rider. She removed her helmet, revealing short, dark hair, her face weathered from the years of living on the edge. "You did well," she said, her voice rough but grateful. "The town owes you everything." Moore nodded curtly, his eyes scanning her as she spoke. She was a leader of her group, that much was clear, and her presence, although a small comfort, meant they weren't alone in this fight. "We've only just begun," Moore replied, his voice resolute. "The syndicate won't give up that easily. They'll return, and next time, they'll be better prepared. We need to start planning. The town needs to be fortified." The woman looked over at Carter and the stranger, who both gave her a silent nod of agreement. "You're right," she said, pausing to adjust the rifle slung over her shoulder. "We've got a safe house just outside town. If we're going to continue this fight, we need to regroup, gather supplies, and strategize. The war's not over, and we need every hand on deck." Moore glanced back at the church, the battle-scarred building that had become their sanctuary. It still stood, but for how long? The enemy would return, and when they did, Moore knew they couldn't afford to fail again. He turned to the woman, his gaze steely. "Lead the way. We'll follow." Without a word, she nodded and turned, her crew following behind her as they made their way through the town. Moore, Carter, and the stranger followed close behind, ready to move out. The night was quiet now, but the air was thick with the knowledge that this fight was far from over. As they walked, Moore's thoughts turned inward. He'd fought in wars, had been part of operations that had taken lives, including his own. He had tried to bury that life, tried to leave it behind, but it always found its way back to him. Cedar Ridge had become his refuge, but even here, the storm had caught up with him. He had been running, but now there was no running left. The road ahead was uncertain, and Moore knew they couldn't face the coming storm alone. They would need allies, people who were willing to fight, to stand alongside them when the next wave came. And as much as it hurt him to admit it, Cedar Ridge wasn't just a town to defend anymore. It was a symbol of resistance, of survival, and, above all, of hope. They reached the safe house on the outskirts of town, run-down building surrounded by thick trees and overgrown grass. The once quiet, unassuming building had become a strategic hub, the place where they would plan their next steps, where they would rebuild. Inside, the woman led them to a room at the back of the house. It was sparse, a few tables covered in maps and intel, radios humming quietly in the corner. The air was heavy with the anticipation of what was to come. Moore dropped his gear onto one of the tables and looked around. The group that had come to aid them wasn't large, but it was strong. There were faces Moore didn't recognize, but their resolve was the same as his. They were fighters, survivors. The woman spoke first. "We've got a small group here. A handful of trained fighters, some civilians we've managed to protect. But we're not enough. If we're going to survive the next assault, we need reinforcements, more people, more resources. And we need to act quickly." Moore nodded, his eyes focused on the maps laid out in front of him. He pointed to a nearby location on the map, a small outpost on the edge of town. There. That's where we need to hit first. It's a supply depot. If we can get control of it, we'll have a fighting chance. The woman turned toward her crew, issuing orders. Prepare the men. We leave at first light. Moore, we'll need you and your team to take point. Moore didn't flinch. We'll be ready. As the group began to prepare for their next mission, Moore sat back, his thoughts dark and heavy. He had known this fight wasn't over. But with every passing day, the pressure mounted. The enemy wouldn't stop. And Cedar Ridge wasn't just a town to them. It was a symbol of defiance. But Moore had one thing they didn't: the strength of his people. We'll keep fighting, Moore muttered to himself. We'll make them regret ever setting foot here. The road ahead would be long, filled with battles, betrayals, and loss. But Moore had made a promise to Cedar Ridge, and he would keep it, no matter what came next. This was just the beginning. The storm had passed, but a new one was on the horizon, and Moore would be ready. The first rays of dawn filtered through the cracks in the blinds, casting a pale light over the war room inside the safe house. The stillness of the morning was a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous night. Moore, Carter, and the stranger stood in silence as they listened to the woman, who had now taken the role of their de facto leader, as she outlined their next move. We've mapped out their known supply routes, she said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet urgency. The depot at the edge of town is a critical point. If we can secure it, we'll be able to disrupt their supply lines and keep them from coming back with reinforcements. Moore's eyes flicked to the map, his fingers tracing the routes on the paper. The location was just a few miles away, surrounded by a dense thicket of trees and broken roads. Perfect for an ambush, but it also meant they were vulnerable if the syndicate decided to reinforce the location. We'll need to move fast, Moore said, his voice low and thoughtful. We can't afford to let them see us coming. Once we secure the depot, we fortify our position. But we can't hold it for long without reinforcements. Carter spoke next, his tone tactical, calculating. The element of surprise is key. We can't go in guns blazing. We'll be outgunned. We'll need to infiltrate the area, disrupt their communication, and take out their leaders first. Moore nodded in agreement. We'll divide into two teams. One team takes point and takes out the guards. The other moves in to secure the supplies and set up a defensive perimeter. Keep radio silence until we reach our positions. The stranger, who had been silently listening, stepped forward. We don't have the numbers to maintain a prolonged engagement. We hit fast, we hit hard, and then we fall back. No heroics. Moore looked at him, meeting his unwavering gaze. I'm not planning to get caught in the open, but we need this. Cedar Ridge needs this. If we can cut off their resources, it'll buy us time. Time for the townspeople to prepare, to fortify. But we need to be quick. The woman from the backup team turned to Moore, her brow furrowed. What about the riders? They're still out there. What happens when they regroup? Moore exhaled deeply, his eyes hardening. When they regroup, we fight. But we fight on our terms. We've been reactive so far. Now it's time to take the initiative. If we disrupt their supply chain, we'll force their hand. They'll have no choice but to take us seriously. She nodded, understanding the weight of the decision. We'll follow your lead. The plan was set. The team gathered their weapons and gear in silence, the weight of the mission hanging heavy in the air. As they prepared to move out, Moore couldn't help but feel the enormity of what they were about to do. The depot wasn't just an objective, it was a turning point. It would either mark the beginning of their resistance or the moment they were wiped out. Moore pulled on his jacket and checked his rifle one last time. He wasn't going to let Cedar Ridge fall, not while he still had breath in his lungs. The town had given him a second chance, and now it was his turn to give it everything he had. He turned to the stranger. You ready for this? The stranger didn't answer right away, but his steady gaze said it all. He was ready. This fight was personal for both of them. Let's do this, Moore said, giving the stranger one last glance before he led the way out of the safe house. The air outside was cold, the smell of smoke still lingering in the distance as they moved toward the outskirts of town. The sound of their footsteps was muffled by the thick layer of dust that had settled over the town overnight. Cedar Ridge was quieter than it had been in days. the streets eerily still after the chaos of the previous battle. It was a false sense of calm. Moore knew that. The storm hadn't passed. It had only quieted for a moment. As they moved through the trees toward the depot, Moore kept his eyes on the horizon. The landscape stretched out before them, a mix of forest and farmland. The path ahead was unclear, but the urgency in the air was undeniable. They couldn't afford to waste time. "We stick to the plan," Moore said, his voice cutting through the cold silence. "In and out. No one gets left behind." The team nodded, their faces grim but resolute. This was the moment that would decide everything. As they approached the depot, Moore could see the faint outline of guards patrolling the area. Their presence was minimal, but they were well-armed and alert. A few scattered tents, rusted vehicles, and barrels of supplies sat in the clearing, all protected by a handful of armed men. But Moore knew it wouldn't take much to incapacitate them. "Stay low," Moore whispered, signaling for the team to move into position. They spread out, each member taking a different route toward their target, carefully moving through the shadows, staying out of sight. Moore's heart beat in his chest, his mind working at full capacity as he counted down the seconds. The depot was within their reach, and he could see the guards' patrol patterns, just enough time to make their move. With a swift motion, Moore raised his rifle and fired, taking out the first guard who had been standing watch near the supply crates. The soldier crumpled to the ground without a sound. The stranger was already moving to take down another guard, while Carter circled around the perimeter, keeping an eye on any approaching reinforcements. "Targets down," Moore muttered into the comms, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're in. Secure the supplies." The team moved quickly, with precision, their movements synchronized. They breached the depot, clearing out the remaining guards one by one. The tension in the air was palpable as Moore watched his team systematically dismantle the enemy's hold over the depot. Supply crates secured, the stranger called over the comms, his voice steady as always. "We've got what we came for." Moore's heart skipped a beat. The depot was theirs. They had cut off a major lifeline of the syndicate, but there was no time to celebrate. The sound of motorcycles revving in the distance pierced the air. More Hellfire Riders, and this time, they were coming in force. "We've got company," Moore said, his voice calm but urgent. "Get ready to move out. We're falling back." They had the supplies they needed. Now it was time to get back to Cedar Ridge and fortify their position before the enemy could regroup. Moore didn't wait for a response. He turned on his heel and began making his way toward the exit, his team following close behind. The fight wasn't over. The storm that had been gathering was finally here, and it was time for Moore and his team to make their stand. The enemy might have the numbers, but Cedar Ridge had something they didn't: hope. And Moore wasn't about to let that die. As they disappeared into the trees, Moore allowed himself one fleeting thought. This was just the beginning. The war for Cedar Ridge had only begun, and Moore would see it through to the end. The morning air had a chill to it as Moore and his team moved swiftly through the dense trees, their footsteps barely making a sound on the soft earth. The depot raid had been successful. They had secured valuable supplies, but the fight was far from over. The rumble of motorcycles in the distance was a constant reminder that the Hellfire Riders were not done. The battle for Cedar Ridge was intensifying, and Moore knew they had to prepare for the enemy's retaliation. "We've got a few miles before we're back at the safe house," Moore said, his voice low, calculated. "Stay alert. We don't know how far behind the Riders are." Carter, who was at the rear of the group, nodded, his rifle held at the ready. "Got it. If they're following us, we'll need to put up a fight before they catch up." The stranger, ever silent, moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the surrounding forest. His presence was a quiet force, someone who seemed always to be 2 steps ahead, anticipating danger before it reached them. Moore didn't know much about his past, but he didn't need to. What mattered was that the stranger was with them now. Solid, reliable, and deadlier than any of the bikers that would be hunting them down. They reached the edge of the forest and paused for a moment, the town of Cedar Ridge just beyond the tree line. Moore peered through the trees, scanning the road ahead. He could see the faint outline of the old road leading back to the town. The sun was still low in the sky, but there was a sense of urgency in the air. The time to rest was over. "We make it back to the safe house. We fortify, regroup, and make a plan for the next phase, Moore said, as the team moved forward again. The tension was palpable. Moore's thoughts kept returning to the depot raid, to the moment they had secured those supplies. It had been a victory, but a small one. The Hellfire Riders were relentless. Moore had seen it before. Men and women who wouldn't stop until their bloodlust had been sated, until every town was under their control. Cedar Ridge was just another stepping stone in their empire. Moore was their obstacle, and they would stop at nothing to break him. The sounds of motorcycles grew louder as they neared the town. Moore's instincts kicked in, his mind racing. There was no time for second-guessing. They had to move quickly. The riders would be on them in no time. Up ahead, Moore whispered, pointing to a small cluster of buildings on the outskirts of the town. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. It was close to the safe house, just far enough away to provide some cover. As they made their way to the buildings, Moore heard the unmistakable roar of engines behind them. The Hellfire Riders were closer now, and Moore's heart quickened. This wasn't just a chase anymore. They had caught up. The storm had arrived. Move fast, Moore ordered, his voice tight with the weight of their situation. We need to fortify the position before they get any closer. They split into two groups. Moore, Carter, and the stranger moved toward the building's rear entrance while the others set up at the front. The safe house was just within reach. They were so close. But Moore couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. We're too exposed here, Carter said, his voice low as he checked the building's perimeter. Once they realize where we're headed, they'll come in hard. I know, Moore replied, glancing toward the road. He could see the dust rising in the distance, the motorcycles closing in. They had minutes, maybe seconds, before the riders arrived. We can't hold out here forever, the stranger said, his eyes scanning the area. We need to find higher ground, somewhere they can't pin us down. Moore's mind raced, working through the options, weighing their best chances. The road to the safe house was too open. The riders would have them in a crossfire before they even made it halfway. But there was one thing they had that the riders didn't, the element of surprise. We move now, Moore said, his voice hard with resolve. Take the rooftops. We'll move in pairs, keep the high ground, and get back to the safe house as quickly as we can. Carter gave a curt nod. On your mark. The sound of motorcycles grew louder, the low rumble of engines signaling that the riders were almost there. Moore motioned for the team to move. They quickly made their way to the back of the building, clambering onto the rooftop. They were visible from the street, but the height would give them the advantage. It was their best chance. Go, 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 Moore hissed. The team moved as one, quickly scaling the roof, their movements swift and practiced. Moore reached the top first, his eyes scanning the road below for any sign of the riders. They were close now, too close. He could see them coming up the road, their bikes kicking up dust as they barreled toward the building. There they are, Moore said, his voice low. Get ready. The riders hadn't seen them yet. They were too focused on the safe house ahead. Moore held his breath, waiting for the right moment. As the first group of riders passed directly beneath them, Moore fired. The rifle shot rang out, the bullet hitting the lead rider square in the chest. The rider dropped instantly, his motorcycle veering out of control and crashing into another bike, sending both riders tumbling to the ground. The rest of the riders scrambled in confusion, but Moore didn't stop. He fired again, taking out two more riders before they had a chance to react. The sound of gunfire echoed down the road, and the riders were thrown into chaos. Keep them off balance, Moore shouted, his voice steady, his hands still shaking with adrenaline. Don't let them regroup. Carter and the stranger fired in unison, their shots precise and deadly. Each rider that fell forced the remaining bikers to scatter, throwing them into disarray. The riders were trained for speed and aggression, but they weren't prepared for the ambush Moore and his team had set up. But Moore knew this couldn't last forever. The Hellfire Riders were regrouping quickly, trying to form a counterattack. We don't have long, Moore said urgently. Fall back. Get to the safe house. The team moved as one, darting from rooftop to rooftop, making their way toward the back of the safe house. The sound of motorcycles revving in the distance signaled that the riders were regrouping, faster than Moore had anticipated. They were coming back, and this time, they would be prepared. But Moore wasn't going to give up without a fight. He had come too far to let them take Cedar Ridge. They had already proven that they could hold their own. But Moore knew that the final showdown was still ahead. "We fight on our terms," Moore muttered to himself, his eyes steely with determination. "We fight until the end." As the team descended into the safe house, Moore knew the battle for Cedar Ridge had reached its breaking point. The Riders were coming for them, but they were going to have to tear the town apart to take it, and Moore would make sure they never had the chance. This was their town, and no one was going to take it from them. The safe house was tense, quiet except for the distant roar of engines approaching. Moore stood at the front, his back pressed against the door, his eyes scanning the horizon. The Hellfire Riders were regrouping, rallying their forces for one last assault. But Cedar Ridge wasn't going down without a fight. Not while Moore and his team still breathed. His fingers tightened around the rifle, the grip familiar and comforting in his hands. His thoughts raced, trying to make sense of everything. The depot raid had been a success, but it had only bought them a brief respite. Now, with the Riders back in full force, the town was once again at risk. The war wasn't over. It was only intensifying. "We've got one shot at this," Moore said, his voice low but commanding. The others were already preparing, setting up makeshift defenses, checking weapons, securing their positions. They knew what was coming. They had no illusions about what it would take to survive this. Hold the line, fight smart, and don't give them an inch. The stranger was already moving to the windows, his rifle aimed out at the road. His expression was unreadable, but Moore knew better than to question his focus. The stranger had been through hell and back, just like Moore. They were both soldiers at heart, and in this war, that made all the difference. Carter was nearby, checking the ammo stores, making sure they had enough to last the fight. His hands moved quickly, efficiently, but Moore could see the tension in his shoulders. They all felt it. The gravity of the situation. This was it. The final stand. "Moore," Carter said, looking up. "We can't keep holding them off like this forever. We need reinforcements." Moore nodded grimly. "I know, but we can't rely on anyone else. Not this time. This fight is ours." The distant sound of motorcycles grew louder, the engines roaring as they approached. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the Hellfire Riders neared. This time, there would be no hesitation, no retreat. Moore moved toward the back of the house, looking at the group gathered there. The woman who had led them through the night stood ready, her rifle slung over her shoulder. Her crew had prepared as best they could, but they all knew the enemy would be relentless. "They're coming in hot," she said, her voice steady. "We hold the line here, but we won't be able to keep them out forever." "What's the plan?" Moore took a deep breath, his mind racing as the sound of engines grew louder. It was coming, the final wave. "We hold this position as long as we can, then we retreat to higher ground. The church. That's where we make our stand." She nodded. "Understood. We've got your back." Moore's eyes flicked toward the others. The stranger was already taking up his position on the second floor, watching the road with laser focus. Carter was moving to the back door, setting up a final line of defense. There was no turning back now. The Riders would hit them soon, and they needed to be ready. The sky above was darkening, the sun slowly sinking behind the horizon. Moore could feel the weight of the moment settling over him. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for the future of Cedar Ridge. If they failed, everything they had fought for would be gone. As the first bike appeared on the horizon, Moore's heart rate quickened. The Riders were here. The final assault had begun. "Ready yourselves," Moore said, his voice commanding. "We fight, and we fight until they're gone. Do not let them take this town." The roar of the Hellfire Riders' engines filled the air as the first wave of bikers charged forward. Their motorcycles ripped through the dirt and gravel, their headlights cutting through the twilight like a dozen predatory eyes. The Riders were determined, but Moore had something they didn't. He had the element of surprise, and he wasn't going to let them win. "Hold fire until I give the signal," Moore ordered, his voice steady despite the growing chaos outside. The first Riders reached the edge of the house, their motorcycles roaring as they skidded to a halt. Moore could see the headlights glinting in the distance as they circled around. They were preparing for a direct assault, But Moore had already planned for this. "Now!" Moore shouted, the words cutting through the tension like a whip. The team opened fire, their weapons cracking in unison as the riders were taken by surprise. The sound of gunfire filled the air as riders dropped one by one, their bodies falling like rag dolls, their bikes crashing into the dirt. But the riders were fast. They didn't falter for long. Moore fired again, watching as another rider went down. The stranger's shots were clean and precise, taking down enemy soldiers as they advanced. The sound of motorcycles revving in the distance told Moore they weren't done yet. "Keep pushing," Moore shouted, his voice fierce. "We can't let them get inside." But even as they held their ground, Moore could see more riders appearing on the horizon. The fight was escalating. The bikers weren't backing down. They would fight until the town was theirs. "Carter," Moore yelled, "we need to move to the next position. There are too many." The back door exploded, the force of the blast knocking Moore off his feet. He hit the ground with a grunt, but quickly regained his composure, eyes scanning for the source of the explosion. The safe house was under siege. "They're inside," Carter shouted from across the room. "We need to fall back." The riders had breached their defenses. Moore's heart raced as the sound of boots pounding through the house echoed in the chaos. The safe house was no longer safe. The town was being torn apart from the inside. "Fall back," Moore shouted again, his voice booming with authority. "Get to the church. Now." The team moved in sync, retreating through the back door and into the night. The safe house was lost, but they still had one chance. The church was the last stronghold they had. As Moore sprinted toward the church, the sound of gunfire continued to crackle behind him. He could hear the riders closing in, their engines roaring like a pack of wolves on their tail. They were relentless, but Moore wouldn't let them win. Not while there was still breath in his lungs. The church came into view, a silhouette against the burning sky. It was their final stronghold, the last place where they could make their stand. Moore's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced back at the others. "We hold the line here," Moore said, his voice low and filled with steely determination. "This is it. We fight for Cedar Ridge. And we fight until the very end." And as the Hellfire Riders closed in, Moore knew this would be their last stand. The storm had broken, but this time, Cedar Ridge would not be taken without a fight. The church loomed ahead like a fortress, its weathered stone walls standing tall against the encroaching darkness. The night was alive with the sound of engines roaring, the shrill screech of tires cutting through the air. Moore's pulse quickened as he reached the steps of the church, his rifle in hand, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The Hellfire Riders were closing in fast, but this time, they weren't going to get the upper hand. The team filed into the church, taking up defensive positions. The stranger moved to the bell tower, his rifle aimed at the far street, while Carter and the woman from the backup team set up barricades around the main entrance. Moore took up position by one of the side windows, his eyes never leaving the road ahead. "This is it," Moore muttered to himself, his heart thumping in his chest. "This is where we make our stand." His grip tightened on his rifle as the sound of engines grew louder, the roar of the Hellfire Riders' bikes reverberating through the ground like an earthquake. Moore could see the silhouettes of the riders in the distance, their figures outlined by the glow of their headlights. It was too late to turn back. The storm was here, but they had one advantage, the church, and they would make sure it stayed theirs. "Ready?" The stranger's voice crackled over the comms, his voice calm despite the growing tension. "We're set." Moore's eyes flickered to Carter, who was now crouched behind the barricades, his rifle aimed at the door. "No matter what happens, we hold this position. If we let them in, we lose everything." Carter nodded, his jaw set with determination. "We won't let them take it." Moore's breath was steady as he watched the bikers draw closer, their engines growling as they sped down the street, a pack of predators closing in on their prey. The first wave of riders reached the edge of the churchyard, their motorcycles screeching to a halt as they dismounted in rapid succession. Their black leather jackets glistened in the moonlight, skull masks covering their faces, their eyes gleaming with menace. Moore's heart skipped a beat. The Hellfire Riders had been a constant threat, terrorizing town after town, leaving destruction in their wake. And now, They had come for Cedar Ridge, but they had no idea what they were about to face. "Get ready," Moore whispered to himself, his finger hovering over the trigger. "This is it." The first shot rang out, sharp, clear, and devastating. The stranger's rifle cracked through the silence, and the lead rider dropped, his body crumpling to the ground with a sickening thud. The rest of the riders scattered, but Moore had anticipated this. The ambush had begun. "Now!" Moore shouted, his voice carrying over the chaos. Gunfire erupted from all sides as the team opened fire. The sound of bullets hitting their targets was drowned out by the roar of the motorcycles, but Moore could see the riders faltering as they tried to regroup. One by one, they fell, shot down as they tried to advance. But the Hellfire Riders were no slouches. They adapted quickly, rallying together to form a tight circle. They weren't going to be stopped easily. "Push forward," one of the riders shouted, his voice loud and commanding. "Take the church." The remaining riders surged forward, their motorcycles revving as they charged at the front door of the church. The gates creaked under the force of their assault, but they didn't give way. The barricades held firm. Moore's heart raced, but his mind was sharp. He could see the enemy's next move. They were getting ready to break through the main door. "Carter, cover the door," Moore shouted. "Got it," Carter replied, his rifle kicking in his hands as he fired another round, taking down a rider who had managed to get too close. "Keep them back," Moore shouted again, his eyes flicking to the windows. He could hear the enemy's motorcycles revving in the distance, their presence like a tidal wave approaching the shore. The riders were closing in. They had surrounded the church, and Moore knew that soon the battle would be over, or they would win. It was a fight to the death. But as the riders pressed forward, Moore felt the weight of their numbers pushing down on him. They were outnumbered. The door to the church shook as a heavy impact rocked it. The riders were forcing their way in, but Moore wasn't done. "Not yet." "Stranger, take the roof," Moore ordered, his voice sharp. "We need that vantage point. Give us cover." "On it," came the stranger's calm reply, and within moments, he was already climbing the stairs to the bell tower, rifle in hand, ready to take the high ground. Moore's thoughts raced. The riders were relentless, but they were focused on the front entrance. If they could hold the door for just a little longer, they could push them back. The second wave arrived, this time with a truck. The heavy vehicle barreled down the street, its tires screeching as it aimed for the front of the church. Moore's eyes widened. He didn't have time to react. "Move," Moore shouted, grabbing Carter and pulling him out of the way as the truck hit the barricade head-on. The force of the impact was deafening, the door rattling violently as the truck tried to break through. The riders surged forward, taking advantage of the breach. But Moore wasn't going to let them through that easily. "Now, now, now," Moore bellowed as he threw a grenade toward the truck. The explosion tore through the street, throwing riders and vehicles into the air, sending debris scattering across the churchyard. The riders scattered in confusion, their assault momentarily halted. But Moore knew this was only temporary. They needed to finish this before the riders could regroup. "We've got them on the run," Carter shouted, his eyes fierce as he fired again, taking down another rider who had tried to circle around to the back. But Moore could hear the motorcycles in the distance, more of them. They were coming, reinforcements on the way. The riders weren't done yet. "Fall back to the altar," Moore shouted, his voice low but firm. "We'll make our last stand there. We hold them off until we can't." The team moved quickly, retreating into the heart of the church. They barricaded the doors once again, pushing the remaining supplies to form a makeshift wall. Moore could feel the urgency in the air as the riders regrouped. They were coming for them, and this time, there would be no second chances. The church doors shook once more as the riders slammed into them. Moore's fingers tightened around his rifle. The stranger's shots rang out from the bell tower, hitting targets with deadly precision. The air was thick with smoke and dust, the ground shaking beneath their feet as the final assault began. "Don't let them through," Moore roared, his voice filled with a raw intensity. For the first time in days, the enemy seemed to falter. The riders, disoriented by the explosion, were regrouping, their numbers thinning under the relentless fire of Moore and his team. Moore took another shot, his heart pounding in his chest. The riders hesitated, and then, one by one, they began to retreat. The shock of the surprise ambush, the sheer force of the church's resistance, was too much. Morse stood, breath heavy, eyes scanning the room. He could hear the sound of retreating motorcycles, their engines fading into the distance. The riders were gone. For now, the fight was over. Cedar Ridge had held, but Moore knew this was only the beginning. The storm had passed. For now, but Moore knew the war for Cedar Ridge wasn't over. They had just begun to fight back. The last of the Hellfire Riders retreated into the night, their motorcycles fading into the darkness, leaving behind the distant sound of their engines and the chaos they had wrought. The church, scarred and battered, still stood. Cedar Ridge had been saved, at least for now. Moore stood alone in the middle of the church, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of his labored breaths. His rifle hung loosely in his hands, a tool of survival, but more importantly, a symbol of their defiance. The fight was over, for now, but the battle had taken its toll. The church's interior was littered with debris, the walls marred by the marks of gunfire, and the floor was streaked with blood, both theirs and the enemy's. Moore didn't move. He let the silence settle around him, listening to the distant sounds of the riders fading further away. The battle had been hard-fought, the outcome uncertain until the very last moment, but they had held the line. For now, Cedar Ridge was theirs, and that was all that mattered. Carter stepped through the entrance, his face smudged with dirt and sweat. His eyes were sharp, despite the exhaustion. "It's over. For now." Moore gave a tight nod, his eyes scanning the church. The others were gathering, all with the same weariness etched into their features. The town had suffered, but it had not broken. The stranger descended from the bell tower, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his gaze steady. His silence spoke volumes, the quiet intensity that always seemed to surround him. Moore trusted him more than anyone else. They had fought side by side in the dark, and together, they had won this fight. "We did it," Carter said again, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he didn't quite believe it himself. Moore's lips curled into a faint, grim smile. "We did, but it's not over. It will never be over until they're gone, right?" Carter said, his expression hardening. "What's next?" Moore's gaze lingered on the ruins of the church, their makeshift stronghold, now marked by the battle. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about ensuring that Cedar Ridge had a future, that the people who called this place home could rebuild, could thrive, without living in fear. "We rebuild," Moore said, his voice steady and filled with quiet resolve. "But we do it on our terms. The riders will come back. The syndicate isn't finished with us. But this is our home, and we're not giving it up." The stranger spoke for the first time, his voice cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. "We'll need more people, more supplies. We can't keep doing this with just a few." "We'll find them," Moore replied. "There's always more to fight for." Carter looked out toward the town, his eyes narrowing in the distance. The sun was beginning to rise over the horizon, casting a soft glow over the town, now beginning to emerge from the shadows of the night. It was a new day, and with that new day came the possibility of a better future. The woman who had led the backup crew walked over, her face streaked with dirt but her posture firm. She stepped into the circle of their group, her eyes meeting Moore's. "We need to start preparing," she said, her voice calm but filled with purpose. "The town's not safe yet. We need to think bigger. They won't stop until they've taken everything." Moore glanced around at the team, his team. He had seen them all fight for this town. He had seen their grit, their resolve, and it was clear that they weren't ready to give up. They would keep fighting, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had chosen to stay in Cedar Ridge. "You're right," Moore said, his gaze resolute. "We'll start small, fortify the town, recruit more fighters, get supplies. And we'll take this fight to them. No more waiting for them to come for us. This time, we go on the offensive." The stranger nodded. "I'll start scouting. There are more outposts to hit." "Good," Moore replied. "We strike where it hurts. Disrupt their supply chains. Take down their leaders. We do it piece by piece, until they can't fight back." Carter gave him a firm nod, his eyes flashing with determination. "We can do this." We've already survived their worst. Now it's time to turn the tables. Moore looked out over the church, the sun now rising higher, bathing Cedar Ridge in the soft glow of early morning light. He could feel the weight of the coming days, the uncertainty that lay ahead, but he knew one thing for sure. They were ready. For the first time in a long while, Moore allowed himself to feel something other than the constant, gnawing pressure. There was hope. There was a chance. And that chance was worth fighting for. We fight, Moore said, his voice firm and unwavering. We fight for Cedar Ridge, for the people, and we won't stop until they know we won't break. And with that, the team gathered their gear, ready to move out once again. They had been tested, broken, and rebuilt. The storm had come, and they had survived. The battle for Cedar Ridge wasn't over, but they had just taken the first step toward winning the war. And with that, the town that had been on the brink of destruction now had something far more valuable: hope. And that hope would carry them through the darkness that was sure to come. Because when the storm had passed, there would always be a new dawn. And this time, they would be ready. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow for another special story.